Hello everyone, welcome to Enigma Vault. I hope my voice and stories can be the bridge between your racing thoughts and peaceful sleep. If this journey can soothe you, please like and subscribe to my channel. You are safe here. Let the story begin. The Arizona sun softened the asphalt, and the tires of Hawk Reyes' Chevy patrol car made a sticky hiss as they rolled over the road. He had one hand on the steering wheel, and the other holding a half-full bottle of tequila. The amber liquid swayed out of the bottle during the bumps and flowed through his fingers into the cuffs of his uniform. This was his regular ritual at noon every day, using alcohol to numb the constant buzzing auditory hallucinations in his right ear. That was the sound of gunfire 3 years ago. He will always remember the broken voice of his partner Luke when he shouted "ambush" on the walkie-talkie, while he was staring at the donut advertisement on the car screen. Reyes, there's a refrigerated truck that broke down at the North Fork of Highway 3. The dispatcher's voice came over the intercom. Surveillance shows the driver left on foot half an hour ago. Hawk stuffed the bottle into the door storage compartment and tapped his fingers twice on the steering wheel. The nearest gas station is 20 miles from North Fork, and the driver of a refrigerated truck, a costly iron coffin, would be crazy to leave it in the desert. He turned the steering wheel, and the outline of the silver refrigerated truck gradually became clear in the dust, raised by the front of the car. The car stopped beside a dry riverbed, with the tires sunk into half a foot of sand. When Hawk got out of the car, the soles of his leather boots were sticky with melted asphalt. He took out his baton and walked around the front of the car to the rear. The metal box shone coldly in the sun, and there were no signs of prying on the lock. "Smith, bring the toolkit." He turned around and called out. The young police officer, Jack, was pulling out hydraulic pliers from the trunk of the patrol car. His face flushed under the brim of his hat. This kid just finished special training yesterday, and he would definitely vomit if he saw a corpse. The moment the lock clicked open, Hawk took a half step back. The cold air, wrapped in a rotten smell, rushed out. He squinted his eyes, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. 13 bodies were stacked on the shelf like frozen chickens, and the girl on the top wore hand-beaded deerskin boots and a faded feather pendant around her ankle, a Cree rite of passage that he had seen on the reservation. Oh my God. Jack dropped his hydraulic pliers to the ground with a clang. They're all Aboriginal. Hawk said nothing. He put on rubber gloves and lifted the top layer of thin blanket. The body was preserved in exceptionally good condition, with the skin having an unnatural bluish-gray hue, as if it had just been placed in a freezer for 2 hours. But the dirt between their fingernails and the spruce chips stuck in their hair told of the long journey they had gone through. He noticed that each of the dead had a needle hole behind the ear, 2 millimeters in diameter, with burn marks on the edges, as if left by some special needle. Reyes. There were shouts in the distance. Hawk looked up and saw a woman in an indigo shirt crossing the cordon. Her ponytail was tied with an eagle feather headband. There was a shallow scar on the left side of her face, extending from the brow to the jaw. "I'm Erin Kavos, from the Cree Community Services Center." She slapped her work ID on Jack's chest. "I heard that the body of an Aboriginal woman was found here." Hawk recognized the name. Last month, at the protest rally on the reservation, she was the one who held up a sign that read "Stop Illegal Mining" and blocked the oil company's exploration vehicles for 3 days. "Back off. This is a crime scene." He reached out to stop them, but Irene bypassed him and went straight to the refrigerated truck. The metal box suddenly made a creaking sound, like the sound of thermal expansion and contraction. Irene paused and subconsciously pressed her ear with her right hand. Hawk saw her pupils shrink slightly, and her Adam's apple roll twice, as if she was trying to hold back some kind of pain. "Cummins X15 engine 2019 model," she suddenly spoke, her voice trembling. "The refrigeration unit is a Carrier Vector 8500, with modified heat pipes, so the contraction sound is 2 scales higher than the ordinary model." Jack took out his notebook and wrote furiously, How did you know? I've been sensitive to metal sounds since I was a kid. Irene opened her ears, blood seeping out from between her fingers. My grandmother said that women from the Cavas family can hear iron talking. She glanced at Hawk, her eyes like a knife. But the price is that every time you use it, your ears will ring for one more day. Hawk narrowed his eyes. 3 days ago, he checked at the bureau and found that 17 indigenous women had gone missing at the US-Canada border in the past 3 months, 12 of whom were Cree. Irene's aunt was one of them. She disappeared on her way to church last winter, leaving behind only half a beaded glove. How do you know for sure that you are related to the family disappearances? Because they all have needle holes behind their ears. Erin suddenly grabbed his wrist, her nails almost digging into his skin. There's a photo among my aunt's belongings, and on the back it says needles from the blue spruce forest. That's the illegal drilling area north of the reservation, and I found this kind of needle there last month. A pungent burnt smell suddenly entered my nose. Hawk pushed Irene away and yelled, "Back off." But it was too late. Orange-red flames rose from the bottom of the refrigerated truck. The metal box was twisted and deformed in the explosion. The gust of air overturned Jack's notebook, and the papers floated into the sky like white butterflies. Irene was knocked into the sand by him. When she looked up, she saw Hawk rushing towards the burning truck. The air wave tore a hole in his uniform on the back, revealing an old scar. It was left by a gunshot 3 years ago. Ries. Jack grabbed his belt. There's nothing in there. The flames licked the fuel tank, making crackling sounds. Hawk stood there, watching the refrigerated truck curl up into a twisted mass of iron in the fire. He took out the tequila from his pocket, tilted his head back, and took a sip, the alcohol dripping down his chin onto the police badge. Irene got up and covered her mouth and nose with her sleeves. The ringing in her ears was louder than ever, as if thousands of bees were fluttering in her ear canals. But through the humming, she heard another sound, a soft sound, like metallic grinding, coming from the burning wreckage of the truck. Hawk suddenly squatted and used his baton to push away the debris from the fire. A charred metal plate was exposed. He wiped the ashes with his sleeve. Half of the letters on it were still left. North, the northern corridor. Irene's voice came from behind her. Her ears were still bleeding, but her eyes were frighteningly bright. The no man's land on the US-Canada border, a 20-kilometer corridor with no surveillance. The fire crackled between the two men, lengthening their shadows. Hawk stuffed the metal plate into the evidence bag and looked up to see Irene staring at the police badge on his chest, which was stained with a drop of tequila and gleamed suspiciously in the sun. Tonight at 8 o'clock, at the old church on the reservation, she turned and walked toward her pickup truck, the eagle feathers on her ponytail swaying in the wind. I have the map of the drilling area you want, but first you have to tell me why your intercom was playing a donut commercial when Luke was shot 3 years ago. Hawk's fingers suddenly tightened, and the evidence bag made a crisp sound in his palm. There was a sirens in the distance. He looked at the dust raised by Irene's car and suddenly remembered Luke's last words. Hawk, there's movement in the north. And now the noise from the north finally reached his feet. Hawk's knees were still pressed against the charred sand as the sirens cut through the silence of the desert. He took off his police hat and let the hot wind blow into his sweaty hair. This was a habit he developed at the scene of the shooting, using physical stimulation to suppress the muffled sound in his memory. It was the same thing when Luke was shot 3 years ago. His police cap rolled into the sand and blood splattered on the cap badge like a withered red rose. Ries. Jack's shout was distorted by the heat wave. The young police officer ran over with the evidence box in his arms. The sand kicked up by his boots hit Hawk's neck. The forensic team is here, they said. The body was burned so thoroughly that they couldn't even find the tooth marks. Did they? Hawk didn't look up. His attention was focused on the half-buried piece of metal at his feet. It was the remains of a refrigerated truck radiator, with solidified oil still hanging on the edge. He picked it up with tweezers and squinted at the sunlight. It's not an original part. The sound was like sandpaper scraping against a gun barrel. I've seen this kind of thin curvature in El Paso, on refrigerated trucks modified for transporting live livestock. Irene had crouched beside him without him noticing. The tips of her cowboy boots were stained with black ash. The eagle feathers in her hair were darkened by the fireworks, and blood was oozing from her left earlobe. The debris blown away by the explosion had just passed by there. A modified cooling system. Her voice had the hum of tinnitus, but her words were clear. Last year, the reservation protested against an energy company that used refrigerated trucks to transport drilling equipment. In order to avoid weighing inspections, they removed the original heatsink and replaced it with a lightweight one. Hawk paused. The metal tip of the tweezers cast a thin shadow between the two of them, like a knife cutting the sunlight. He remembered what Luke said before he was shot. There's movement in the north, and the suspicious truck tracks he saw on the border surveillance 3 months ago, all of them were modified models of this type. How do you know? He asked, his voice hoarser than usual. Irene pulled the scarf from around her neck and pressed it over her ears. The scarf is the traditional Cree spruce green color, with running reindeer embroidered on the edge. Before my cousin disappeared, she worked in a refrigerated truck factory in Winnipeg. She stared at the police badge on Hawk's chest, where the tequila stains had dried, leaving a light golden mark. Her last phone call said that her boss accepted a special transport and would not let her see the cargo list when loading. The wind suddenly changed direction, bringing a burning smell into my nose. Hawk put the metal piece into the evidence bag, moving as slowly as if he were defusing a bomb. He thought of Luke's autopsy report. The bullet was .308 caliber, consistent with the rifle used by Energy Company security. He thought of the chat he heard in the bar last week, saying that the auction of drilling rights in the northern corridor had been brought forward by 3 months. Old Tom, he said suddenly, an old man who lives alone in the desert, at the mouth of a red sandstone valley. His telescope can see 20 kilometers. Erin stood up, her muscles taut under her denim jacket. Now, the wind at the mouth of the red sandstone valley smells of rust. Old Tom's tin house leans against the cactus bushes. The solar panels on the roof are covered with sand, and a row of faded Coke bottles are placed on the windowsill. Those are the desert stars he collected. The old man opened the door and didn't ask who they were. He just stared at Hawk's police badge for 3 seconds, then turned sideways and said, "The coffee is brewed, pour it yourself." The tin house was filled with a mixed smell of pine resin and tobacco. Old Tom's hands were like dry bark, and there was an old scar on the inside of his wrist from pouring coffee into the mug, shaped like a twisted snake. 4 days ago in the middle of the night, he said, sitting in a rocking chair with a battered copy of National Geographic on his knees, I heard a diesel engine. It wasn't the usual water truck. It sounded like sand stuck in my throat. Hawk and Erin looked at each other. The sound of the modified engine was exactly the model they analyzed at the explosion site. Directions? Irene asked, her voice as soft as if she were trying to comfort a frightened deer. Old Tom pointed out the window. There was a map on the glass with the location of the northern corridor circled in red. Go northeast, across the Soda Lake, and toward the border of the reservation. He suddenly opened the National Geographic, and underneath was a yellowed photo. 3 girls in school uniforms standing in front of a church, the one in the middle wearing the same eagle feather hairband as Irene. Are you Martha's niece? His voice trembled. The year Martha disappeared, I saw a refrigerated truck at the entrance of the valley. The license plate was covered with a piece of rag. Irene's fingers dug into the back of the chair. Hawk saw her Adam's apple move, as if she was swallowing something hot. Thank you, she whispered. We need... The sound of gunfire ripped through the resinous air. The first bullet ripped through the tin roof, then blew a hole next to old Tom's coffee cup. Hawk rushed over and pulled Irene down. Jack had already rolled behind the door, and the movement of drawing his gun was awkward. which was typical of a rookie. 3 o'clock, Hawk yelled, as the bullet whizzed past his ear and burned a scorch mark on the wall. They have a sniper rifle. Old Tom's rocking chair shook violently at the sound of gunfire. Hawk glimpsed a double-barreled shotgun that the old man pulled out from under the chair cushion. The barrels were polished to a shine, obviously not the first time he had used it. "There's a wind-eroded rock behind the valley," Old Tom roared, loading his gun. "Get out through the kitchen window. I'll cover you." The desert sun suddenly became sharp. Hawk pushed Irene into the kitchen, not even noticing the glass shards piercing the back of his hand. He could hear his own heartbeat, like pounding against a rusty iron barrel, just as fast as it had been when Luke had been shot 3 years ago. But this time his hands didn't shake. "Follow me." He pulled Irene over the low wall, sand filling his boots. Jack flanked to the right. The wind-eroded rock area is like a natural maze. Hawk moved along the ochre-red rock wall, hearing the crisp sound of bullets hitting the rocks. There were 3 attackers, and their tactics were very professional, encircling the enemy from both sides. He reached for the intercom at his waist and pressed the send button. "This is Reyes. Coordinates N32-17. Armed attack. Forget about it." Irene's voice came from the left. Her denim jacket was cut open, and she held the hunting knife given by Old Tom in her hand. They gave the signal long before it went dark. She tilted her head and listened. The one on the left has heavy footsteps and is wearing combat boots. The one on the right has shortness of breath and may be injured. Hawk's pupils shrank slightly. He recalled what Irene had said at the explosion site the night before about the metal contraction sound recognition engine, and suddenly realized that it was not some metaphysics. It was the hearing instinct trained through years of being in a noisy environment. "Follow me." He pointed to the narrow crevice in front of him. "This is a one-way passage. Let's block the main exit." When the third attacker rushed into the crevice with a rifle in hand, he was greeted by the dull thud of Hawk's baton hitting his wrist, and the sharp sound of a hunting knife cutting through Irene's tactical vest as she jumped down from the top of the rock above. Jack's pistol fired almost at the same time, and the bullet grazed the attacker's ear and penetrated into the rock wall. The 3 were defeated instantly, throwing smoke bombs into the sand as they retreated. When the smoke cleared, only 2 empty magazines and half a torn license plate were left on the sand. Hawk squatted down and picked up the magazine with a pen. There was a small K on the primer. He recognized it as the mark of Kodiak Energy Company. Erin crouched beside him, her fingertips lightly running over the notches on the magazine. The wind lifted her ponytail, and the eagle feathers brushed across the wound on the back of Hawk's hand, like an unspoken comfort. When Luke was shot 3 years ago, Kodiak had just obtained the exploration permit for the Northern Corridor. Her voice was soft, but like a piece of red-hot iron. "And on the day my cousin disappeared, Kodiak's drilling truck drove into the reservation." Hawk looked up to the north. "The sky there is dazzlingly blue, but it looks like a piece of glass covered with dust, and you can't tell what's hidden underneath." He put the magazine into the evidence bag, and the metal buckle clicked, like some kind of gear starting to turn. There was the roar of a helicopter in the distance. Jack was standing on guard with his gun raised, while Old Tom was standing in front of the tin house, wrapping the photo of the 3 girls in a blue cloth. Hawk fished out the bottle of tequila from his pocket and unscrewed the cap, but didn't drink. The wine swirls in the bottle, reflecting the eagle feathers in Erin's hair, and the rigs looming on the northern skyline. "Tonight at the old church," Irene said, her voice drowning out the roar of the helicopter. "I brought a more detailed map." She paused, her eyes sweeping across the police badge on Hawk's chest. "Also, I asked someone to retrieve Luke's intercom records from the police station." Hawk's fingers tightened around the evidence bag. He remembered Luke's last words. "There's movement in the north. The bullets from Kodiak, and the girl with eagle feathers in Old Tom's photo. All the fragments suddenly formed a vague shape in his mind, like a map covered with sand and dust, slowly being blown away by the wind. As the shadow of the helicopter passed overhead, Hawk heard himself say, "I won't make a mistake this time." And 300 kilometers to the north, under a drilling platform, the iron door of a cold storage creaked open. The man in the white coat looked down at his watch and said into the intercom, "The target has been locked. They are too close." In the darkness, a row of numbered metal cabinets trembled slightly, like some sleeping giant beast slowly opening its eyes. The Arizona sun softened asphalt, and Hawk's beat-up Chevy pickup made a deathly gasp under the hood as it rolled over the hot pavement. Irene, sitting in the passenger seat, rolled down the window. The wind blew sand in her face, making the eagle feather behind her ear rustle. It was woven from the eagle feather her mother got from the last hunt, and it was said that it could guard the souls of the tribe. "Stop the car." Irene suddenly patted his arm. Hawk stepped on the brakes, and the tires left charred marks on the ground. She pointed to the faded blue sign ahead and said, "Western Express. That's the company the license plate is registered to." The metal door of the truck company was half open, and the bell on the lintel had rusted into a dark red. When Hawk pushed open the door, the hum of the air conditioner mixed with the smell of mold came out. The girl at the front desk was staring at the computer. When she heard the noise, she looked up suddenly. The coffee cup hit the edge of the table with a clang, and the brown liquid splashed on the name card on her chest. "Lisa Brown, employee number, police." Hawk showed his badge. Lisa's Adam's apple moved. Her eyes swept across the holster faintly visible under his epaulettes, and then quickly dropped to her twisted fingers. She wore a silver ring on her right ring finger with RB engraved on the inside. Hawk remembered that there was a girl named Rachel Brown in the missing persons report last week. She was 20 years old and disappeared while working at a border convenience store. Erin said nothing, walking around the counter and approaching the computer. The Excel spreadsheet on the screen stopped at the July transportation record page, with the last line reading, "Red Falcon 07, refrigerated truck cargo, frozen beef route, Highway 27, No Man's Land, Highway 10. She tapped the keyboard with her fingertips, and the page suddenly jumped to a cat video. It turned out that Lisa pressed the shortcut key when she approached. At 3 o'clock last Wednesday morning, Irene's voice was like a sharp blade. When the Red Falcon 07 returned from the US-Canada border, it carried 2 tons more than when it left. She took off the eagle feather and placed it next to Lisa's shaking hand. On the day my sister disappeared, a refrigerated truck also passed through this route. Lisa's tears hit the eagle feathers with a pop. Only then did Hawk notice the dark blue color under her eyes, as if she hadn't slept for several nights. They said it was a cow. She sobbed and took out the USB flash drive locked at the bottom of the drawer. But I checked the weighing slip. The empty truck weighed 8 tons when it went there, and 10.3 tons when it came back. Can a cow grow so fast? She suddenly grabbed Irene's wrist, her nails almost digging into the flesh. Last Friday, the driver of Red Falcon 07 came to claim reimbursement, and I smelled a smell on him, like the smell of meat that has been stored for a long time, not the smell of beef. As Hawk took out the evidence bag and put the USB drive in it, he heard footsteps coming from the back room. Lisa's face turned pale in an instant. "Boss." He installed surveillance. The door was kicked open with a bang. A man wearing crocodile pattern leather shoes was blocking the door, with a gold chain dangling from his collar. 2 tattooed men followed behind him, one of whom was hitting his palm with a baseball bat. "Miss Brown." The boss's smile was like frosted glass. "Did I say the things you shouldn't look at? Take a look at this." Hawk held the USB drive in front of him. "My friend at the IRS said that your transportation declarations for the past 3 years have lacked 3 million pounds of frozen goods." He shook his phone. "I have just synchronized the data to the Bureau's cloud drive. Unless you want to be on the front page of the Arizona Post tomorrow, truck company owner buys yacht by issuing false invoices. The boss's temple throbbed. He stared at the police badge on Hawk's chest, then glanced at the eagle feather in Irene's hand. The feather glowed amber in the sunlight, like some ancient oath. "Go away." He suddenly waved his hand. "But don't let me see you again." When the three rushed out of the company, a heat wave carrying sand and dust hit them on the head. Jack got out of the patrol car holding up a satellite map from the bureau. "I just found out that the last GPS location of Falconero 7 was in Deer Creek Valley. Over there." Deer Creek Valley. Erin opened the brown paper bag she brought with her. Inside was a missing persons map she had collected over the past 4 years. Last month, 3 Cree girls disappeared at a gas station near Deer Creek Valley. She pointed to a point circled 7 times in red on the map, and here her fingertips paused on the blank space on the US-Canada border. Is exactly the starting point of the 20-kilometer unsupervised corridor. Hawk plugged the USB drive into Jack's car computer. In the shipping record, the line of July 15 suddenly hurt his eyes. There was a string of crossed-out numbers in the remarks column, and upon closer inspection it was 23:04:17, the date when Luke died. "Someone is matching the times." Erin's voice was as low as a whisper. Her eagle feather was blown up by the wind and swirled down on the black account printout, just covering the 3 words, Luxie Valley. In the distance there was the roar of a truck engine. Hawk looked up and saw a black pickup truck without a license plate driving out of the company's back alley. The person in the driver's seat was talking into the walkie-talkie. The sunlight shone on the windshield, reflecting a blurry outline of a person in a white coat, exactly the same figure as the one seen in the surveillance video of the drilling platform the night before. "Let's go." Hawk turned the car key, and the engine roared like a broken gong. He fished out the tequila from his pocket and took a sip from the bottle. The moment the liquor burned his throat, he seemed to hear Luke's voice exploding in his ears. "There's movement in the north. This time, he wouldn't get it wrong." The roar of the engine cut through the Arizona heat as Hawk parked the police car on a dry salt flat 300 meters away from the protest area. Jack's wrists trembled as he unbuckled his seatbelt, and the sound of the metal buckles colliding reminded Irene of the crisp sound of the refrigerated truck locks closing. That was the sound she had memorized during her 3 nights in the morgue. "Are you sure you want to be so direct?" Hawk turned the tequila bottle in his palm twice, without unscrewing it, but just resting it against his chin. The scar at the corner of his eye shone white in the scorching sun, like an old open wound. The image of the man in the white coat he had seen in the alley behind the truck company the night before was still burning into his retina, and in the passenger seat, Irene was retightening her eagle feather hair tie, the feather brushing against the tattoo on her collarbone. The Cree Thunderbird totem, which was almost identical to the faded tattoo on the back of the neck of the woman in the refrigerated truck. The moment Deer Creek Valley was covered by eagle feathers, in the black account, Emily Green's name popped up. 3 notifications on my phone. Erin pulled the hem of her khaki overalls, revealing her muddy deerskin boots. She organized a Protect the Mother River protest, which had just splashed red paint on the Deer Creek Valley drilling platform last week. Jack leaned his head out of the back seat, the police badge on his chest, dazzling people. But the protesters hate the police the most, especially the Border Patrol. He spoke the last few words softly, as if avoiding the bullet hole under Hawk's epaulets. That was the bullet that Luke blocked for him 3 years ago. Hawk suddenly laughed, and his laughter sounded like sandpaper rubbing against rusty iron. "So we need Cree social workers as shields." He pushed open the car door, and the wind blew in sand, making the brown paper bag in Irene's arms rustle. It contained the copper badge taken from the neck of the female corpse in the refrigerated truck, and there were dark brown blood stains in the feather pattern. The protest area was more lively than expected. 20 or so blue and white tents were lined up along the stream, and where the water should have been clear, there were oily spots floating on it, giving it a sickly rainbow color. The signs were arranged like a small forest. with words like "Stop stealing water" and "Deer Creek Valley is not your septic tank" painted in a shocking red. On the grassy slope in the front row, 7 Aboriginal girls held hands and sang war songs. They all had eagle feathers tied to their braids, the same style as Irene. Stranger, the sound came from the left. The woman in the indigo tie-dyed dress stood in the shadow of the tent with her arms folded. There were silver threads mixed in her black hair, and the teardrop mole at the corner of her eye made her scrutiny more sharp. Erin recognized her as Emily Green, the organizer on social media who had held a megaphone and shouted, "Oil companies are drinking our blood." Just as Jack was about to show his police badge, Hawk calmly held his wrist. Erin took a half step forward, her moccasins rolling over a piece of broken glass, the remains of a "Stop Fracking" sign, with fresh red paint still on the edges. Kavos, Erin Kavos. She pulled open the collar of her work jacket, revealing a ptarmigan tattoo on her collarbone. Cree, 4 generations buried in the cemetery in the upper Deer Creek Valley. The wind lifted the ends of her hair, and the eagle feather hairband shone golden in the sun. At 3 o'clock last Wednesday morning, someone brought 13 bodies across the border in a refrigerated truck. They all wear this around their necks. She pulled the copper badge out of the brown paper bag. Emily's pupils shrank. The back of the badge was engraved with 2018 Protect Deer Creek Valley, a commemoration of the protest that year. The tattoos, the earrings, the badge on the bodies, all say that they belong to an erased group. Erin lowered her voice, as if to soothe a frightened pony. Like the half-missing glass case in your tent that I saw on Facebook Live, it contained the silver bracelet of Mary Bell, who disappeared in Emily's fingers unconsciously picked at the folds of her tie-dyed skirt. Mark Miller's voice could be heard in the distance as the burly man in the leather jacket kicked over a bucket of ice water, splashing 2 elderly men holding signs that read "Clean, don't pollute." Singing is useless. They're pumping frack fluid into the creek tonight. When he turned, Erin saw a hideous scar on the back of his neck, shaped like a twisted snake. "Follow me." Emily suddenly turned around, and her tie-dyed skirt swept across the flyers on the floor. Hawk touched Jack's elbow, and the 2 men fell 2 steps behind. When passing by Mark, the man suddenly grabbed Hawk's police uniform sleeve, and the smell of alcohol and gasoline hit him in the face. "Police?" The policeman who said last time, "I promise not to tear down the tent," came with a bulldozer the next day. Hawk's fingers curled at his sides. The last phone call Luke made before his death rang in his ears. "There's movement in the north. I'll go check it out." Then there were gunshots, and he shouted, "Come back," at the top of his lungs. He stared at the scar on the back of Mark's neck. The shape reminded him of the metal pipe in the hands of the white-coated man in the drilling platform surveillance. "Mark." Emily's voice cracked the air like a whip. Mark let go of his hand, spat viciously, and turned to walk towards the pile of oil drums by the stream. Several young people followed him, and one of them, a blonde girl, looked back at Irene and seemed to want to say something, but stopped herself. It was dark in the tent, and the light that filtered in through the gaps in the canvas cut Emily's face into 2 halves of light and dark. She pulled out a tin box from the bottom of the display case. Inside was a yellowed photo, a girl in a deerskin skirt, a family holding a protest sign, an old woman fetching water from the creek. "These are the people," she tapped a family photo with her fingernails, "who disappeared in 1987 when the first well was drilled in the Deer Creek Valley." Irene's breath stopped. The little girl in overalls in the photo was 70% similar to a certain ID photo in the file of the female corpse in the refrigerated truck. "What do you want to know?" Emily closed the tin box. "But answer me first." She stared at the badge on Hawk's chest. Why would a border patrol agent come to find protesters with a Cree social worker? There was a sudden noise outside the tent. Mark's roar drowned out the war song. "They are here to get information." Last time, old Tom had a chat with the police, and the tent was burned in the middle of the night. Several figures holding torches ran over from the other side of the stream. In the light of the fire, the blonde girl was being dragged by Mark's arm towards the oil drum pile, and the copper bells on her wrists jingled, exactly the same as the one on the wrist of the female corpse in the refrigerated truck. Hawk put his hand on the holster at his waist, and then slowly released it. Irene felt the eagle feather in her pocket, and it felt like silk soaked in blood. Emily flung open the tent flap, and her tie-dyed skirt fluttered in the wind. The protesters' gazes were like needles, piercing the backs of the three outsiders. Mark pushed the blonde girl to the front of the crowd, the brass bell on her wrist still ringing. "Ask her, who secretly gave strangers directions to the rig last night." The blonde girl's face turned pale. Irene saw a flash of metal on her neck, the same copper badge worn by the female corpses in the refrigerated truck. The fire crackled and flew in the sand, and Irene's boot heel rolled over a charred corn cob. She had searched for similar charred residue in the ashes the night old Tom's tent burned. At this moment, the circle of protesters was tightening like a noose. Mark's thick fingers almost poked Hawk's police badge. Border Patrol. Last time the state police said they would protect old Tom, whose propane tank exploded in the middle of the night. Hawk's Adam's apple moved, and he rubbed his knuckles against the pocket of his faded denim jacket. There was a half-full bottle of tequila, a comforting object he touched every time he was anxious.
Erin noticed that his eyelashes cast shadows under his eyes, much like the closed eyelids of the women she had seen at crime scenes.
"We are looking for the murderer who killed 13 Aboriginal women." She raised her voice, the eagle feather in her pocket, poking her palm. It was given to her by her grandmother, before she disappeared. The brass bells on their wrists are the same as the girls. The crowd suddenly fell silent for a moment. The blonde girl huddled behind Mark, the copper bell ringing softly as her trembling wrists rang, just like the sound of frozen arms hitting the metal partitions in the refrigerated truck. Surveillance. Emily's tie-dyed skirt brushed against Erin's trouser legs. "How do you prove it?" She dug her nails into the edge of the tin box. The lid still had scratches from the security guard's last protest. "My grandmother disappeared in 1997. Irene heard her voice trembling. This was the first time she talked about this in public. She went to deliver herbs to the clinic on the reservation, and passed through the no-man's corridor on the way. 3 months later, someone found her silver bracelet in the sewage pool of an abandoned drilling rig. It was made by the same Indian handicraft workshop as the copper badges around the necks of the female corpses. Mark's face froze and the fire made the tips of his ears turn red. Erin knew what he was thinking. Someone had filled his truck's gas tank with sand in the early hours of last Wednesday morning. His mother's diabetes medicine had been lost in the mail the month before. The suffering of the indigenous people is like a torn blanket, and everyone can pull out their own pain from the corners. What she said was true. Sarah Johnson's voice was like a cold stone dropped into boiling soup. The woman who always knitted wool socks in the corner of the tent was now holding a faded family photo. The man in the plaid shirt in the photo, Irene recognized him as the lumberjack who disappeared near the no man's corridor last spring. "My son wore a brass badge like that before he disappeared." She ran her fingers along the edge of the photo. "He said it was a talisman to protect him from the patrols." The protesters' circle loosened. Emily's tin box clicked open, revealing 27 brass bells neatly arranged inside, each tied with a faded red string. "These are left behind by women who have gone missing in the past 3 years." Her voice was as soft as a sigh. "We dare not call the police, because every time we call the police, 3 more people go missing." Hawk took off his badge and placed it on the low table at his feet. The crisp sound of metal hitting the wooden table made several old men tremble. The Border Patrol took off their badges more solemnly than taking off their uniforms. "My partner chased a smuggling vehicle in the no man's landing 3 years ago." He loosened his collar, his Adam's apple rolling as he swallowed the desire for tequila that welled up in his mouth. "I said at the time that the vehicle didn't have a refrigerated sign and couldn't be carrying people. As a result, he chased it into a blind spot and had his leg broken by a modified freezer compartment. He pressed his knuckles against his temple where there was an old scar. What I'm looking for now is not some protester, but the bastard who froze 13 bodies into ice sculptures. Jack suddenly squatted down and took out a stack of photos from his backpack. Irene glimpsed that the top photo was a close-up of the chassis of the refrigerated truck. It was taken after Hawk knocked out the security guard on duty with a beer bottle. We found out that this car belongs to the logistics subsidiary of Western Energy. The tips of the young police officer's ears turned red, just like the first time he went on a mission. They have 7 illegal oil wells in the no man's corridor, and they use missing people as living targets for sewage discharge. The wind suddenly picked up, making the tent cloth rustle. Erin smelled gasoline, not from a campfire but from a diesel engine.
David White. Emily's voice suddenly turned cold.
A man in a black tactical vest stepped out of the darkness, followed by 6 security guards similarly equipped. There was a scar on his left cheek that ran from his brow to his jaw. Irene had seen this face at a shareholder reception for Western Energy when he was handing the CEO a glass of whiskey spiked with tequila. "Miss O'Connor," he said, his eyes sweeping across the crowd, stopping at Sarah's family photo. "Unlawful assembly is a violation of state statute." Mark's fists were clenched until his knuckles turned white. "Fuck the state laws." He picked up the shovel at his feet. "You stole our land, polluted our rivers, and now you want to drive us away." "Mark." Sarah rushed over and hugged his waist. The shovel fell to the ground with a clang, hitting the blonde's feet. The girl suddenly squatted down, and when she picked up the shovel, a copper badge slipped out from her collar. It was the same one on the neck of the female corpse in the refrigerated truck. David's eyes flickered, dispersed within 3 seconds. He reached for the stun gun at his waist. "Otherwise I'll call the National Guard." "Wait," Irene heard her own voice like an alarm bell ringing. She thought of the scratches under the driver's seat of the refrigerated truck, of what Maggie had written in the autopsy report, crude oil residue between the fingernails, and of the words, "Well, no." 17. No man's corridor, engraved on the inside of her grandmother's silver bracelet. The blonde girl was looking up at her, with the light of the campfire dancing in her pupils. Perhaps it was the same light that the female corpses saw in the freezer at the end. The wind blew sand and hit the tent poles, making a slight sound like metal contracting. Irene took out an eagle feather, and the barbs on the feather pierced into her palm. She suddenly saw clearly. David White's tactical boots were stained with dark brown mud. That was the color of oil mixed with red soil, unique to the no man's corridor. "Let them go," she heard herself say, her voice calmer than she expected. "But Mr. David," she stared at the scar, "you'd better hope no one goes missing tonight." In the darkness came the roar of a car engine starting. Irene counted the frequency of the sound. It was a Cummins engine specially made for Western Energy, the same model as the refrigerated truck. She took out her cell phone and quickly pressed the shutter button of David's back. In the photo, half of a document bag is exposed from the pocket of his tactical vest, and the words, "Well, no, 17, wastewater discharge record," can be vaguely seen. The bonfire suddenly exploded with a loud bang, and sparks shot up into the night sky like a flare that had not yet landed. The bonfire swirled in the wind and sand, and sparks hit Irene's eyelashes. She could hear the sound of her Adam's apple rolling. 30 feet away, David White's tactical boots crunched over the gravel, and every step felt like stepping on her tense nerves. 7 security guards fanned out, their riot shields glowing a cold, hard blue in the firelight, while protesters clutching placards had whitened their knuckles. Mark's gruff voice blasted out from the crowd. "They're going to tear down our water source. Whoever quits today is a wimp." The word "softy" got stuck in my throat. As Mark was about to rush out, Irene grabbed him by the back of his collar, her nails almost digging into his jeans. Her eyes swept over the third person in the security team, a blond boy in his 20s. with his riot shield lowered low, revealing his blue chin. She had seen this face at the gas station yesterday. He was squatting in front of a convenience store and calling his mother, saying, "This job can pay for my sister's tuition." "Linda." Erin turned and grabbed the volunteer's wrist. Linda was stuffing throat lozenges into the protester's hands when she was dragged and staggered, panic appearing in her blue eyes. But when Irene leaned close to her ear and said, "You showed me your daughter's drawing of a red-tailed hawk last week," the panic suddenly froze. Linda's daughter attended the reservation elementary school, and Irene went there every week to teach the children how to weave eagle feather rings. "Tell them that the well demolition machine cannot enter the empty corridor tonight." She pointed in the direction of the blonde boy. Just say that their captain's tactical boots are stained with oil mud from well number 17, and the border agency is watching." Linda's Adam's apple moved. The wind lifted her plaid scarf, revealing the same eagle feather pendant as Erin's around her neck. Erin had knitted it for her after the protest last week. I'll try." She clutched the corner of her scarf and walked quickly to the edge of the crowd. At the same time, the sound of stones rolling down was heard from the other side of the sand dune. Hawk wiped the sand off his face, turned around and made a lower posture gesture to Jack. The old patrolman's tactical belt brushed against the cactus thorns, and the pain reminded him of the rainy night 3 years ago. At that time he also crouched down and went around behind the drug dealer's car, but he didn't expect that there was a shotgun hidden in the passenger seat. His Adam's apple moved, and he reached for the walkie-talkie at his waist. His fingertips touched the flat bottle of whiskey, and then he suddenly pulled his finger away. "We're here." Jack's breath hit the back of his neck. The two men were lying on a 3-meter-high sand dune, with the rear of David's team just below them. Hawk took off his police hat and slapped the sand with the brim once, twice. It sounded exactly like the footsteps of the reinforcements. Jack understood what he meant and took out a high-powered flashlight and shone it towards the sky. The white light illuminated half of the night sky, as if more car lights were approaching. "Head!" The blonde boy suddenly tugged at David's tactical vest. His riot shield slid down an inch, revealing the red corners of his eyes. "There seems to be movement behind us." David's temple throbbed. He turned around and looked back, only to see the undulating sand dunes glowing silver-gray in the moonlight. But the faint sound of footsteps was like a thin needle pricking the back of his neck. What made him even more uneasy was that the eyes of several old hands in the team began to wander. The volunteer with the red scarf had come over at some point and was whispering to Lowley from the second team. Lowley is a retired soldier who has always been a stubborn person, but at this moment he loosened his grip on the riot shield and his Adam's apple moved up and down. "Pack up," David suddenly shouted. His tactical boots rolled over the embers of the campfire, and the sparks splashed on his trouser legs. But he was too lazy to take a picture of it. He just stared in the direction of Irene. The woman was standing at the forefront of the protesters, with an eagle feather pendant dangling around her neck, like some kind of silent provocation. "You are lucky today." He threw down this sentence, and when he turned around, the document bag in the pocket of his tactical vest was exposed more clearly. The words "No. 17. Well sewage discharge record" flashed in the firelight, and he covered it up by pulling the corner of his clothes. After the roar of the security vehicle swept away the dust, the protesters' cheers were just beginning to be cut off by a sneer. Mark kicked the empty water bottle at his feet, and the plastic bottle hit Irene's feet. "Just let them go like this. Do you know how many people they will bring tomorrow?" Emily tugged at his sleeve. "At least there's no blood." "It works without bleeding?" Mark shook her hand off. "Do you think the oil company is afraid of our rhetoric? My grandfather's legs were crushed by their drilling machine. Do you want to follow his example and lie in a wheelchair for the rest of your life?" He glanced at the crowd. Some people lowered their heads, some bit their lips, and the bonfire cast a swaying shadow on everyone's face. Irene took out her cell phone and saw that David's briefcase in the photo was still hot. She heard Hawk's footsteps coming from behind her, the sound of sand rubbing against leather boots. But what was clearer at this moment was Mark's heavy breathing and Emily's muffled excuses, like two strings that were gradually tightening and could break at any time. The wind picked up again. Irene clenched the eagle feather, and the pain of the barb piercing her palm made her sober. The crisis tonight has been temporarily resolved, but when the sun rises at dawn, what we need to face may no longer be external enemies. As she watched the protesters gradually split apart, she suddenly remembered what her grandmother said before she died. The sharpest knife is often hidden in the hands of one's own people. Hawk's whisper came from behind the dunes. I took a picture of the sewage record number. Irene didn't look back. She looked at the dying embers of the bonfire and listened to the increasingly clear arguments among the protesting crowd. She suddenly felt that the real storm had just begun. When the last sparks of the campfire were blown away by the night wind, Irene finally let go of the eagle feather. The blood drop from the thorn on the palm of my hand glowed dark purple in the moonlight, like a solidified tear. She heard the sound of Mark's leather boots crunching over gravel, a sound that was harsher than the sound of the campfire going out, approaching behind the sand dune where Hawk was. The foreign police badge is really well polished. Mark's voice was like sandpaper polishing a rusty gun barrel. When you let the oil company's security car go yesterday, did you calculate how many more days we would have to endure tear gas? Hawk leaned against a cactus bush, only half of his silhouette visible in the shadows. He reached for the wine bottle at his waist, but paused the moment he touched the metal. It was the bloodstains that splashed on the bottle when his partner was hit by a stray bullet last year, and he still hadn't wiped it clean. If I were you, I wouldn't be the one to worry about now. He turned the screen of his phone to Mark, and the numbers of the refrigerators with 13 bodies in the photo were glowing. The drilling site you protested buried 13 Aboriginal women last month. Mark's Adam's apple moved. In the afterglow of the campfire, the tattoo on his wrist was grayish-blue. It was the outline of his grandfather's right leg that was crushed by the drilling machine. Don't use the dead as bargaining chips. He grabbed the gasoline barrel at his feet, and the sound of metal collisions scared away several night owls. Tomorrow morning I will take people to block the oil pipeline. You'd better not follow me, Mark. Sarah's voice came from the other side. This Aboriginal woman, who always braided her silver hair into two small braids, clutched a faded clan emblem necklace. Erin showed me her grandmother's missing person file, and the wounds on those bodies. She swallowed. The wounds on those bodies were the same, all from the teeth of the drilling drill. Mark's fingers left white marks on the gasoline barrel. He stared at the crest swaying on Sarah's chest. It was the Cree's unique Thunderbird totem, and it was from the same lineage as the eagle feather pendant on Irene's neck. Have you been brainwashed by them? He yelled, kicking over the supply box at his feet, and the compressed biscuits rolled all over the floor. Whoever doesn't go to block the pipeline tomorrow is not a real Aboriginal. Irene, who was behind the sand dunes, watched this scene and suddenly remembered her grandmother's hand before she died. The old man was also shaking like this at the time, grabbing her wrist and saying, "What they want is not the land, but for us to tear ourselves apart first." She took out her cell phone, and the photo of David's file bag was still hot in the album. It was the approval document used by the oil company to apply for a drilling permit using unclaimed missing persons. In the date column, the date of Grandma's disappearance was circled 3 times in red pen. Emily is shaking. Hawk stood behind her without her noticing. He smelled of the leather of his holster and a hint of tequila. He had obviously not been able to hold back on that bottle of wine. Following his gaze, Erin saw the protest organizers crouching next to an abandoned truck, their fingers folding flyers into crumpled balls. "You should go talk to her." Hawk lowered his voice, as if he was trying to comfort a frightened horse. "She helped us hide the drone yesterday, which shows that she has a sense of justice." When Irene walked over, Emily was burying the folded flyers in the ashes of the bonfire. They said I was too soft. There was still blood between her fingernails from the daytime scuffle with the security guard. Mark said we should burn down the control room of the drilling site. And Sarah said we should cooperate with the police to find evidence. But I just want my daughter to be able to wash clothes by the clean river in the future. Irene crouched down beside her. The wind lifted her denim jacket, revealing the Cree embroidery on the inside. It was sewn by her grandmother herself, using scraps of cloth from her missing brother's swaddling clothes. The year my grandmother disappeared, she also said she was going to the river to wash my brother's diapers. She pulled out the photo of the corpse on her phone and quickly swiped away. The oil company is not afraid of fire, they are afraid of the truth.
13 bodies, 13 erased records of disappearances that would turn their drilling permit into a license to kill.
Emily's fingers rested in the campfire ashes. She looked at the embroidery on Irene's coat, and suddenly remembered the old woman she had seen in the reservation last month. The old Cree woman who always waited for her missing granddaughter at the church door. She looked 70% similar to Irene, the donor that Mark contacted. She lowered her voice. Recently always asked us to block the small pipes, but the one that really polluted the groundwater was... There was a sound of breaking glass from the other side of the dune. When Hawk rushed over, he saw Mark pushing Sarah onto the supply truck, and several radicals were holding spray paint cans, trying to spray "Blood debt must be paid with blood" next to the slogan "Stop illegal drilling." Sarah's family crest necklace broke, and the Thunderbird pendant rolled to Hawk's feet. When he bent down to pick it up, he felt the tiny letters engraved on the back. MJ87, exactly the same as the last number of the frame number of the refrigerated truck. That's enough. Hawk slammed his pistol on the sand. The sound of metal collision startled everyone. It was the gun his partner used when he died, and there was a bullet hole on the butt. You are fighting among yourselves now, which is a good opportunity for the oil company to bury the evidence deep. He stared at Mark's red eyes. Sarah said that your activities are funded by the Border Charity Foundation. Do you know who the major shareholder of that foundation is? Mark's can of spray paint clattered to the ground. The moonlight shone on his face, and he could see the veins on his forehead throbbing, as if they were about to burst. You're talking nonsense. I'm talking nonsense? Hawk took out the document he secretly photographed from the security car. They just transferred $2 million to the foundation last month, and the note was community relations maintenance. He slapped the document on Mark's chest. What they want is for you to make as much trouble as possible, so that the government has a reason to send the National Guard to clear the area, and then the drilling permit will be automatically extended. The protesting crowd suddenly became so quiet that one could hear the sound of sand moving. Sarah picked up the family emblem on the ground, and the Thunderbird's eyes shone coldly in the moonlight. Emily took out the bank statement of the activity funds from the truck, and her fingers trembled as she read the transfer records of the Border Charity Foundation. The next day after each payment was received, the protest site would be changed to a safe area, prepared by the oil company. So they asked us to block the small pipes, Sarah said in a voice as light as a sigh, because the pollution data of the large pipes has long been laundered by the agencies they bribed. Mark took 2 steps back and knocked over the plastic barrel of gasoline. The smell of gasoline mixed with the burnt smell of the campfire came up. Some people began to sob softly, and some clenched their fists. As Irene watched all this, she suddenly remembered another sentence her grandmother said before she died. When you think you are fighting the enemy, you may have already been holding the flag for them. Hawk's phone vibrated at this moment. He glanced at the bank account details Sarah had just sent him, and when he put the phone in his arms, his fingertips touched the Thunderbird pendant engraved with MJ. In the moonlight, the letters on the back of the pendant glowed dimly, like some kind of code waiting to be deciphered. The roar of drilling rigs came from afar, echoing lingeringly in the desert. Irene took out the eagle feather and stabbed the barb into her palm again. The pain this time is clearer than ever. The real battlefield is never on the border, but in the heart of everyone who wants to keep the truth. The desert nights are harsher than the days. The strong wind carries sand through the tent cloth of the makeshift camp, making a sound like sandpaper rubbing against each other. Hawk squatted by the campfire, the cold light of his mobile phone screen making his eye sockets appear deeper. The bank statement sent by Sarah left a dazzling track on his fingertips. The transfer records of the Border Charity Foundation were like a string of poisonous pearls, each of which corresponded to the transition time of the protest. They are marking the battlefield for us. Irene's voice came from behind. When she squatted, the heel of her cowhide boots crushed half a piece of charred firewood. Grandma said that, when you think you are lifting the roof, you may be helping people reinforce the beams. The eagle feather barbs on her palm pierced into the flesh again, and blood oozed out like a drop of solidified amber in the moonlight. Hawk took out the Thunderbird pendant from his pocket, and the mark of MJ87 hurt his fingertips. He found it at a scrapyard last week when he was tracking a suspicious pickup truck. The truck overturned into a sand ditch, and a rusty iron box rolled out from the back of the truck, with the pendant at the bottom of the box. MJ could be Maggie Ogier, he whispered. That Quebec medical examiner's sample library number. Maybe it's related to the missing person case. Irene's pupils shrank slightly. Her great-aunt disappeared in 1987, while leading her tribe to protest an oil company's drilling on the reservation. The bonfire suddenly crackled and sparks flew. 20 meters away, she saw Linda Thompson distributing water bottles to new volunteers. Her light blonde ponytail swayed in the wind like a moving signal flag. Linda worked part-time in the logistics department of the oil company. Irene poked the fire with the toe of her boot. Last week, when she was helping me move supplies, she told me that the company had recently hired a group of part-time photographers. Hawk's knuckles were white from cracking. He thought of the refrigerated truck that had been stopped at the border checkpoint 3 days earlier. The 13 bodies had petroleum residue embedded in the fingernails of the people there, an exact match to the composition of the special crude oil used by Silver Star Energy on its drilling platform in North Dakota. They need protesters to be vandals, he suddenly said. If the media captures you burning pipes and smashing equipment, the FBI can clear the scene with domestic terrorism charges, and the investigation into the disappearances will be completely shut down. Irene stood up suddenly, and the blood drops on the eagle feathers fell on the sand like a withered carnation. I'll go talk to Linda. The convenience store at 2 o'clock in the morning emitted a cold white light. Linda placed the last box of hot coffee on the counter, and the glass door rattled in the wind. She stared at the surveillance camera on the wall, pretended to organize the shelves, and tapped her fingertips on the oatmeal boxes on the third row 3 times, the signal she had agreed with Irene. The vending machine in the corner suddenly made a click sound and spit out a can of Coke. When she bent down to pick it up, a piece of paper slipped out from the gap in the machine, with a smell of rust. Tonight at 10 o'clock, Old Mill Warehouse. The handwriting was Hawk's, and the letters were as rough as if they had been rubbed with sandpaper. Linda stuffed the note into her overalls pocket and looked up to see a man in a navy blue jacket standing at the door. His face was in shadow save for his jawline, which was as hard as granite. It was David White, Silver Star Energy's chief of security. Miss Thompson. David's voice was like ice. Are you still working overtime so late? Beads of sweat formed on the back of Linda's neck. She remembered that when she delivered water to the protesters last week, David's car was parked behind a sand dune 300 meters away. The car windows were covered with dark film, but a ray of cold light leaked through. It was the reflection of the surveillance camera. I helped the boss watch the store. She forced a smile and pointed to the canned soup on the top shelf. Uncle John has a bad back and can't reach it. David didn't move. His eyes flicked to the pocket of her overalls, where Hawk's note bulged. I heard you often hang out with those environmental lunatics, he suddenly said. Be careful, some people's enthusiasm can backfire. The convenience store clock struck 2:30. and Linda counted the seconds until he left. Only after the last buzzer of the glass door faded away did she rush into the back alley and vomit until her knees weakened behind a trash can. The wind lifted the corner of her clothes, and a note in her pocket rubbed against her skin, burning like a piece of charcoal. The old mill warehouse is located on the edge of the desert, and the abandoned cement silo looks like a piece of blackened tooth. Hawk squatted behind a sand dune 20 meters away. Through the telescope, he saw Linda's figure passing through the hole in the barbed wire. He touched the pistol at his waist. The faded tape wrapped around the handle still had body temperature. It was a relic of his deceased partner. Every time he touched it, he could hear the dull sound of a bullet piercing his colleague's chest. There are 3 people behind her. Irene's voice came from the intercom, with an electric noise. She hid in a dead tree across from the warehouse, and heard the sound of metal contracting, the engine of a Ford F-50, the same model as David's. 2 o'clock, wearing tactical boots, Cadence. Hawk's temple was throbbing. His old problem of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, came back, and he could clearly recall the ambush 3 years ago. He misjudged the number of drug dealers, resulting in Jimmy being hit by a stray bullet, and his blood splattered on the graffiti on the border wall like a red rose blooming in the wrong season. "Keep your distance," he said into the intercom, his throat tight. "They want to capture me alive." The moment Linda pushed open the warehouse door, the smell of mold and gasoline hit her in the face. Moonlight leaked through the broken roof, illuminating the half-person high cardboard boxes piled on the ground. The top one was open, revealing half of a cracked plastic pipe, exactly the same as the oil pipeline that Silver Star Energy was laying. She took out her cell phone tremblingly, and when she pointed the lens at the cardboard box, the flash suddenly exploded in the darkness. "Put your phone down." David's voice came from the shadows. 4 security guards stood behind him, the electric batons in their hands flashing a faint blue light. Linda's fingers slid quickly across the screen. Just as she sent the last message, someone grabbed her wrist from behind and her phone fell to the ground with a bang. "Smart girl." David squatted down and picked up the broken phone. But being too smart is stupid. He flipped through the recent chat history, and when he saw the name Hawk Reyes, he sneered. "Looks like I have to invite your savior to have a cup of tea." Hawk stood up suddenly behind the Jew. Linda's scream came from the intercom, followed by an electrical noise. His hand that was reaching for his gun paused. Jimmy was like this before he was shot. He held the gun but didn't dare to pull the trigger for fear of hurting civilians by mistake. Irene jumped down from the tree, eagle feathers swaying in her hair, her eyes shining like phosphorescence in the desert. "They are waiting for us to go in." "That's perfect." Hawk stuffed the Thunderbird pendant into his collar, the metal hot against his skin. "I've waited enough." The moment the iron door of the warehouse was kicked open, dust rose like a cloud. Hawk's eyes swept over the fake props on the ground. Stones with fake blood stains, smashed surveillance cameras, and even a set of riot shields painted red. The red paint was mixed with fluorescent powder, which would show the Silver Star Energy logo under the ultraviolet flashlight. "Nice trap." Irene kicked the camera at her feet, which still had the unedited footage stuck in it. In the footage, protesters were holding Molotov cocktails and rushing towards the oil pipeline, with the pre-recorded Go to Hell Oil guys playing in the background. She pulled out her phone and started recording. She could hear the rumbling sound of metal contraction. 3 SUVs were approaching. Their engine model was Ford F-50, the same as David's convoy. "It's time to go." Hawk tugged at her sleeve. Several strong lights flashed outside the window, which were the beams of flashlights. He counted the footsteps. 3 on the left, 4 on the right, and 2 straight ahead. The same number of people who had been ambushed 3 years ago. The sound of his heartbeat overwhelmed the tinnitus in his ears, and he suddenly laughed. His laughter mixed with the friction sound of sand grains. "Jimmy, I won't hide this time." The moment the warehouse door was pushed open, Irene reached for the eagle feather at her waist, and the pain of the barb piercing her palm brought her back to consciousness. Hawk stood in front of her, his shadow stretched out by the flashlight like a flag erected in the desert. They heard the shouts of the security guards getting closer, but at the same time they recalled the same image. 13 bodies in the refrigerated truck, the petroleum residue in the nails glowing a faint blue light under the autopsy light, just like the cold light shining on their faces at that moment. "Are you ready to dance?" Hawk turned around with fire burning in his eyes. Irene clenched the eagle feather tighter, and blood dripped from her fingers onto the fake protester shield, forming a bright flower. It's time for them to panic. In the darkness, several beams of strong light shone into their eyes at the same time. Hawk's pupils contracted out of habit as the white light of the flashlight pierced the darkness. He had seen this light 7 years ago, when he was chasing drug dealers in the Sonoran Desert. He was huddled in a cactus bush, listening to his colleagues' screams being swallowed by sand. At this moment, when the third beam of light from the left flashed across the iron barrel in the corner, he suddenly laughed, and his Adam's apple rolled as he swallowed the taste of tequila that was rushing to his mouth. 7, he whispered, tapping the back of Irene's hand. 7 times. There were also 7 people in the ambush 3 years ago, when bullets came from 7 directions. He hid in the drainage ditch. He could smell the rubber of the security guard's boots now, mixed with the stale smell of motor oil in the warehouse. The 3 on the left had heavy footsteps like rammed earth. They were in combat boots. The 4 on the right were lighter, probably in tactical running shoes, and were going around to the back wall. The man in front, holding a high-powered flashlight, with smoke in his breath, was David White himself. Erin dug her nails into his wrists. Her ears were roaring, not the sound of metal contracting, but her own heartbeat. The pain of the eagle feather barb piercing her palm ran up along her nerves, allowing her to see the location of the ventilation duct clearly. It was just 3 meters to their right. The iron pipe wall was illuminated by the flashlight, revealing a silver edge. There was a thin layer of dust on the mouth of the pipe, but there were fresh scratches on the edge, as if it had been pried open recently. "See that pipe?" she whispered in Hawk's ear, blood dripping onto his badge. "I went through the same one 2 years ago when I was helping to build a church on the reservation." Hawk's eyes swept across the mouth of the pipe. The shadows of the security guards pulled at the wall, the nearest one already touching the latch of the warehouse door. He suddenly bent down, picked up the gasoline barrel at his feet, and threw it in the direction of the third beam of light on the left. At the moment when the sound of metal collision exploded, the tactical running shoes on the right really messed up their rhythm. They were looking for cover. Now, Irene dragged him towards the pipe. Her shield hit the wall of the pipe, causing her palms to go numb, but the reflected light blinded the person smoking in front of her. Hawk swung his baton backhand and hit the nearest flashlight accurately, and the light spot instantly shattered into pieces. The pipe opening is narrower than expected. Irene took off her coat, and the eagle feather pendant made a harsh scraping sound against the iron sheet. She went in first, turned around and pulled Hawk's belt. She could smell the smell of tobacco and gun oil on him. It was too similar to the smell of oil on the bodies in the refrigerated truck, like a metaphor for some kind of fate. The pipes were stiflingly hot. Irene's knee scraped against something hard, and with the residual light of the flashlight, she saw half a crumpled document. Transportation record. She pinched the corner of the paper. The ink had already spread, but the words Black Ridge Drilling Area and Unmarked Vehicle hurt her eyes. Hawk's fingers tapped out a Morse code-like rhythm on the pipe wall. There was a fork ahead. The left was a dead end, and the right led to the outside. But just as they climbed to the third bend, there was a sudden loud knocking sound above their heads. David's voice rolled over the iron pipe with a sickening laugh. "Miss Cavos, Officer Reyes, do you want to die in the desert heat?" Irene's sweat dripped down her chin onto the documents. She felt a dent in the pipe wall, as if it had been hit by a rifle butt. The exit was sealed. Hawk's breathing suddenly became heavy, and she knew he was back to the night of the ambush, the sound of the bullet piercing his colleague's shoulder blade playing on a loop in his mind. "Listen to me." She grabbed his wrist and pressed the bloody eagle feather into his palm. "Jimmy wouldn't want you to give up now." Hawk's fingers tightened suddenly. There was a new noise outside the tunnel, not the muffled sound of tactical boots, but the crisp sound of sneakers stepping on gravel, mixed with a woman shouting, "They're in there." It was Jack Smith's voice, with a young man's unique cracking voice. Sarah pushed the roadblock over here. Irene leaned against the wall of the pipe and heard clearer noises. The sound of protesters' shields colliding, the crackling of resin when torches burned, and the war song that Sarah shouted in Cree. "It was the protesters I coordinated," she smiled, and blood dripped onto the documents, forming a small red flower. Jack, that kid, actually convinced them. Hawk had reached the baffle at the end of the pipe. There was a sound of twisting metal coming from outside. The protesters used a jack to pry open the sealed iron plate. The moment the light came in, Irene saw Jack's face. The sleeves of his police uniform were torn, and his face was stained with blood, but his eyes were as bright as stars in the desert. "Oh," Jack yelled, as the protesters behind him held up shields and formed a human wall, blocking the security personnel's advance. Irene stuffed the documents into her arms and followed Hawk out of the pipe. The night wind blew sand into her face, and she saw David's face distorted in the torchlight, like a crushed sand lizard. "This is just the beginning." David's voice was drowned out by the protesters' slogans. He reached for the gun at his waist, but Sarah's torch had already been thrown over, exploding a flame at his feet. As they ran toward the pickup truck Jack had driven up, Erin touched the papers in her arms. The edge of the paper still retained the heat from the pipe, and a name on it made her fingers tremble suddenly. Mary Kavas, her missing aunt. Her name was printed prominently on the list of missing person replacement workers. "Let's go to the reservation," she said to Hawk, the taillights of the car leaving 2 red streaks in the desert. "My aunt's old house contains the family tree of 4 generations. Those documents need the help of the tribe to interpret them." Hawk stepped on the accelerator, and the sound of the pickup truck crunching over the gravel was like some kind of war drum. In the rearview mirror, the oil company's searchlights were still shaking, but the protesters' torches formed a fire dragon, brighter than any surveillance. Jack was sorting documents in the back seat when he suddenly looked up and asked, "Do you think the oil residue in the refrigerated truck, could it be from the Black Ridge drilling area?" Irene looked out the car window at the moonlight. In the distance, the totem poles of the Cree reservation loomed in the night, like guardians who had been waiting for 100 years. She touched the eagle feather pendant around her neck. The bleeding had stopped, but the pain was still there. It was the mark of awakening, the weight of the truth. "Yes," she whispered, "we'll find out." The sound of the pickup truck's engine crushed the night. Ahead, the lights of the reservation were lighting up. As the pickup rolled over the gravel road at the entrance to the reservation, Erin smelled pine resin mixed with campfires. In the moonlight, 12 totem poles stood like silent sentinels on both sides of the square. The old wooden pole in the center, carved with a thunderbird and a salmon, was the one she had touched when she followed her aunt to attend the ceremony as a child. The crack caused by the bear's claws was still there, and now it was filled with bloodlines with new vermilion paint. "Stop the car." Hawk suddenly stepped on the brakes. Jack groaned in the back seat, and the documents in his arms scattered all over the floor. Irene followed his gaze. 6 figures wrapped in deerskin vests were sitting around a bonfire in the center of the square. The gray-haired old man in the middle was smoking a briar pipe, with sparks flickering on his wrinkled face. It was Chief John, and the hook-nosed old man on his right who was staring at them the whole time. Irene recognized him as Elder Robert. It was he who smashed the survey team's GPS equipment with a deerskin drumstick, when they were protesting against the oil company's land occupation last year. Turn off the engine. Erin pushed open the door, her boot heel crushing a patch of dry sage. Hawk tugged at her sleeve. Don't be in a hurry, they have bows in their hands. Only then did she notice that in the shadows beside the campfire, several young men were holding longbows, and the arrows were shining coldly in the moonlight. Girl from the Kavos family. Chief John's voice was like sandpaper scraping against a pottery jar. Last time you came here, you were delivering medicine to Grandma Ruth, and now you're leading white police officers into our holy land. Irene raised the documents in her arms to shoulder height. I brought something that can reveal the murderer. She glanced at Elder Robert's eyelids and saw them twitching. That was the reaction she had seen at the tribal council meeting. Whenever someone mentioned the word missing, this old man who adhered to tradition would show an expression between pain and vigilance. The family tree is not your filing cabinet. Robert suddenly spoke, his pipe banging loudly in his palm. 40 years ago, the government took our family tree and took away the Bear Creek Basin. 20 years ago, the mining company used the family tree to prove that we were in pure blood and occupied the hunting grounds. Now you want us to hand over the names of 4 generations of our ancestors to the Border Patrol? His eyes swept over the badge on Hawk's waist. And let them check our ancestors like they check smugglers? Hawk reached into his coat pocket and paused again. There was a half-full bottle of tequila, his old friend who used it to calm his nerves. He cleared his throat. We just need to confirm whether the names on the list are Cree. When the girls were stuffed into the refrigerated truck, they had pine tar embedded in their fingernails, which matched the crude oil samples from the Black Ridge drilling area. He pulled out a photo and pushed it over, a close-up of the interior of the refrigerated truck. If the family tree can prove their kinship, we can link the oil company to the human trafficking chain. Oil company? Chief John took the photo, his pupils shining in the fire. Last month, they said they were going to build an oil pipeline in Deer Leap Valley, saying it was no man's land. He suddenly slammed the photo on the ground. You white people always talk about evidence, but when our girl disappeared, where was your police car? There were footsteps coming from the other side of the square. Irene turned her head and saw Alicia James, who was wearing a ponytail and holding a stack of birch bark scrolls. Standing in the shadows, the silver bracelet on her wrist was made with old coins that Irene taught her last year. Chief, Alicia's voice was clear and bright. I went to the river to collect herbs yesterday and saw 3 people in work boots rummaging through an abandoned hunter's cabin. They have the Western Energy logo on their car. Elder Robert stood up suddenly, and his pipe fell to the ground and broke in 2. You are helping outsiders to muddy the waters. The ones who muddy the waters are those who treat corpses as cargo. Alicia took a step forward, her bracelets jingling. Before my cousin Lydia disappeared, she said that a truck passed by Condor Rock every Wednesday at midnight, which matches the time when the refrigerated truck was found. Irene seized the opportunity and pulled out a yellowed newspaper clipping from the file. In 1987, the day Mary Kivas disappeared, someone also saw a Western Energy exploration team entering the reservation. She touched the eagle feather pendant around her neck. My aunt's name now appears on the list of replacement workers. Elder Robert, your granddaughter Sarah said 3 years ago she was going to town to buy some cloth. The elder's face turned pale instantly. The square suddenly became so quiet that one could hear the sound of pine branches crackling in the bonfire. Hawk noticed Chief John tapping his fingers against his thigh, a habit he performed before making decisions at tribal council meetings.
The family tree is in the sacred tree house, John said suddenly, but only the Kavos family can see it. He glanced at Hawk. The white policeman stayed in the square.
Robert wanted to retort, but John raised his hand to stop him. The old man's eyes swept over Alicia, and then fell on the documents in Irene's arms. It must be returned before sunset. As Irene followed Alicia toward the sacred treehouse, she heard Jack's whisper from behind. Officer Hawk, look at the elder's pipe. She turned around and saw Hawk squatting down and picking up the pipe that was broken into two halves. At the broken part, she could vaguely see the small words, Sarah, 9. Irene's heart beat wildly when the wooden door of the sacred treehouse creaked open. Moonlight leaked through the round hole in the dome, illuminating the birch bark scrolls against the wall. Those family tree scrolls were strung together with deer, sinew thread, and every page was soaked with the sweat and tears of 5 generations. Just as she was about to reach out her hand, there was a commotion from the direction of the square. Several young tribesmen were running over from the north. One of the boys had fresh mud spots on his deerskin pants. He shouted as he ran, "The traps by the river have been broken. There are wheel tracks." Alicia grabbed her wrist. "It's the tire tracks of a 4-wheel drive vehicle. The same ones we saw at Condor Rock last month." Irene watched the boy's back as he ran toward the chief, the eagle feather pendant burning against her collarbone. She knew that the reservation would not be peaceful tonight. When the wooden door of the sacred treehouse creaked closed behind her, Irene's fingertips could still feel the rough touch of the birch bark scroll. Moonlight leaked through the dome hole, casting a silver column at her feet, but was interrupted by a sudden explosion of noise from the direction of the square. It was the shouting of young people mixed with the dull thump of deerskin boots on rammed earth, and the boy's repeated cry, "The trap broke in two. The wheel marks are deeper than last time." Alicia's hand tightened from her wrist, the beads on the deerskin glove itching her skin. The tire tracks at Condor Rock last month were from a modified 4-wheel drive vehicle. The girl's breath swept behind her ear. "My father said the tracks were so wide that they looked like they could hold a whole cow." Irene looked at the boy's back as he ran towards the chief, and the eagle feather pendant on her collarbone suddenly became incredibly hot. That was the last time her mother braided it for her before she disappeared. It was made with the tail feathers of the tribal condor. She touched the pendant, turned and walked towards the square, her boot heels crushing a few birch leaves blown down by the night wind. The bonfire in the center of the square crackled, and sparks shot into the night, illuminating the groups of people gathered in 2 groups. On the left were 5 young men in their 20s, 2 of whom were clutching broken pieces of a trap, with mud still dripping from their buckskin trouser legs. On the right stood Elder Robert, his gray hair disheveled by the night wind, his cracked pipe clenched in his palm, the engraved mark of Sarah R. 1998 flickering in the firelight. "You are trying to lure the wolves into the tent." Robert's voice was like sandpaper scraping against iron. Back then, the white people took pictures of our totems with cameras, and then came to steal our land. Now they want to check our family tree. Will they dig up our ancestral graves next? His eyes swept across the crowd and stopped at the file bag in Irene's arms. "Girl from the Carvos family, your mother's disappearance case has been under investigation for 10 years. Has the FBI ever given you a word of truth?" The noise of the young people faded for a moment. Irene saw Hawk leaning against an old pine tree at the edge of the crowd, the toe of his combat boots rubbing against a piece of gravel. He was listening, and seemed to be looking further away. That was how he looked when his PTSD was acting up. His pupils were dilated, as if he was recalling a bloody night. 10 years ago, my mother disappeared while collecting herbs." Irene took a step forward, her deerskin skirt sweeping across the pottery jar beside the campfire. 3 days later, someone found her silver bracelet in a dry riverbed outside the border. She took out the eagle feather pendant from her neck. "She made this for me before she left. She used the tail feathers of a condor. A condor never flies in the wrong direction." There were gasps from the crowd. Alicia squeezed next to her and held her hand. "My sister said she was going to town to buy fabric 2 years ago and she never came back. The tire tracks I saw at Condor Rock last month, and the sound of rain on the night my sister disappeared." The girl choked. "They are very similar." Robert's pipe creaked in his hand. "Have you forgotten it? The white man took the document of cooperative investigation and cheated us of half the mountain of copper mines. He turned to Chief John, who was sitting on a stone block beside the campfire, turning a string of bone-carved rosary in his hand. "John, what did your father say before he died?" "Family tree is the root of bloodline. A tree without roots cannot survive the winter."
That's trash.
John's fingers paused. The moonlight illuminated the wrinkles at the corners of his eyes, and those wrinkles hid the stories that Irene had seen in her childhood. He once carried injured tribesmen over the snow-capped mountains to find a doctor, and he also stood in front of a bulldozer when the Federal Army demolished the tribal school. At this moment, he was looking at the young people in the square. There was the same fire in their eyes as his own back then. "My sister disappeared in 1983. John suddenly spoke, his voice as soft as a sigh. Everyone fell silent amid the crackling of the bonfire. "She went to the neighboring town to sell handmade blankets and promised to be back before dark." He took out the old photo in his arms, the edges of which were worn and frayed. Later, someone found her hairband in the waste dump of the refinery. It was the same dye as the sample from the 1980s that Maggie Forensic kept. Robert's face turned pale instantly. Irene noticed that his hand, which was holding his pipe, was shaking, and his knuckles were turning blue. Hawk had walked up to her at some point, smelling only slightly of alcohol, probably because he had been holding back for a long time. The refinery belongs to Westland Energy, and they have 12 illegal oil wells near the border. His voice was like sandpaper polishing a gun barrel. "Those wells require a lot of cooling water, and have drained the groundwater in 3 reservations." The young people's discussion started again, this time with a sharp tone. Alicia held up her phone, and on the screen was a satellite map. Last week, a drone captured a newly paved dirt road about 20 kilometers north of Condor Rock, which coincides with the direction of the refinery's oil pipeline. She looked at John and said, "Chief, our sisters didn't disappear on their own. They were taken away by a truck." John's bone rosary clattered to the floor. He bent down to pick it up, but Irene picked it up first. The last bead on the rosary was engraved with the same letters as those on Robert's pipe. "Sarah R. is my sister," Robert said suddenly, his voice as hoarse as a broken bellows. He loosened his grip on the pipe, the scratches on the broken pipe gleaming coldly in the moonlight. In the spring of 1998, she went to deliver wool to the church school, saying she wanted to buy a rag doll for her niece. He looked at the genealogy file bag in Irene's arms. "I didn't let you check it because I was afraid." The old man's shoulders slumped. "I was afraid that if I opened the family tree, it would be full of bloody names." The square fell into deathly silence. Only the occasional sound of the campfire startled a few crows roosting at night. Hawk squatted down, picked up John's bone-carved rosary, and shook it in his hand. "Sheriff White found the oil from the refinery under the refrigerated truck last month, which matched the special lubricant of Westland Energy." He looked at John. "Those girls are not missing. They are silenced, because they have seen the location of the oil well." When John looked up, tears glistened in his eyes. He turned to Robert, who was staring at the broken pipe in his palm, as if looking at some crushed memory. "We can't let Sarah's tragedy happen again," John said, with the determination of an old chief in his voice. "Cabos, Reyes, you can check the family tree, but it must be under the supervision of the Elders' Council." He looked at the young people. "Also, send 4 people to the river with Officer Jack tomorrow to trace the wheel tracks." Robert opened his mouth, but in the end he just sighed heavily. When he turned around, the broken pieces of his pipe slipped from his fingers and hit the stone with a clink. Irene squatted down to pick up the fragment. The moment she touched the notch, the eagle feather pendant became hot again. This time it was not a burning pain, but a burning clarity, like her mother whispering in her ear. "Find the way." The crowd began to disperse. Alicia dragged a few young men to get the rubbing tools. Jack ran after them, his combat boots causing gravel to fly everywhere. Hawk walked over to Irene, took out the flat bottle of wine from his coat, paused, and put it back in his arms. "Are you going to the sacred treehouse?" He pointed to the file bag in her arms. before the moon goes down. Just as Irene was about to nod, the roar of a car engine was suddenly heard outside the tribal fence. The voice was very low, but it carried a kind of deliberately suppressed brutality, like a wild beast grinding its teeth in its throat. She looked up, and through the gaps in the birch forest, saw two bright white car lights piercing the night, slowly approaching along the dirt road outside the tribe. Hawk's hand was on the pistol at his waist, his eyes sharp as a knife. "It's not a patrol car." His voice was soft, but it was like an icicle piercing the eardrum. The tires are mud tires, 4 wheels. Irene touched the eagle feather pendant around her neck. This time the temperature was no longer scorching, but like a ball of red-hot charcoal. She looked at the outline of the car lights becoming clearer, and heard her own heartbeat drowning out the roar of the engine. That was no ordinary visitor. 300 meters outside the fence, a modified black SUV slowly stopped. The man in the driver's seat took off his sunglasses, revealing a scar on his brow. He took out his intercom and pressed the call button. "The target is in the tribe. Get ready for action." The night wind blew up the weeds on the roadside, swept past the Western Energy badge embroidered on his shoulder, tore his words into pieces, and blew them towards the sacred tree house under the moonlight. The night was like a gauze soaked in ink, casting a hazy shadow over the sacred tree house of the Cree tribe. When David White's black SUV rolled over the gravel road, the chassis made a muffled sound, startling the night owls on the branches which flapped their wings and flew into the sky. He took off his sunglasses and pinned them on his collar. A scar ran diagonally from his left eyebrow to his jaw, shining like cold iron in the moonlight. It was caused by a broken wine bottle from a protester during a conflict over an oil well in North Dakota. 3 years ago, a lawyer from Westland Energy later paid $3 million to make that scar his proudest medal.
"Boss, there's some movement over there on the fence." The thin guy in the passenger seat pointed at the front windshield.
Through the mottled birch forest, several blurry figures can be seen moving towards the sacred tree house. One of them is a man in a leather jacket, with his hands on his waist. He is Hawk Reyes, a veteran of the Arizona Border Patrol, who stopped their oil truck outside Tucson last week. David pulled at his sleeves, revealing the Western Territory Energy emblem embroidered on the inside. He pushed open the car door, and the desert night wind brought the smell of rust into his nostrils. This was the smell of leaking crude oil, and it was also the battlefield he was most familiar with. As soon as his feet touched the ground, the searchlight inside the fence lit up, causing his pupils to shrink suddenly. "Mr. White, it is not polite to visit so late at night." Chief John's voice came from behind the fence, wrapped in a beaded deerskin cape. The 60-year-old Cree leader stood in the moonlight like a bronze statue. Elder Robert beside him was clutching the eagle-bone scepter, his knuckles turning white. That was the key to the tribe's 4-generation family tree. David showed a standard business smile, but did not intend to take off the tactical flashlight on his waist. "Chief John, the drilling project in Bear Claw Valley in the West Territory has been continuously disturbed. We have evidence that the protesters' supply truck passed through your tribe's ranch 3 days ago." He raised his hand and pointed at Hawk. "What's more, this Border Patrol officer is taking outsiders to check the family tree that only tribal members can see." Irene Carvos stood half a step behind Hawk, and the eagle feather pendant around her neck suddenly became scorching hot. She stared at the shadows swaying at David's feet. 5 entourage members, 3 holding telescopic batons and 2 with holsters on their backs. The young tribesmen gathered at the steps of the sacred tree house, and Alicia's knuckles cracked as the tips of her cowboy boots crushed the gravel. That was the girl whose tent was destroyed by the oil company's bulldozer last week. "Mr. White, the tribe's ranch is public land." Hawk took a half step forward, the smell of alcohol and tobacco emanating from him. "As for the genealogy, Miss Carvos is of Cree descent according to Section 17 of the Aboriginal Cultural Protection Act. She has the right to access the records of her immediate family. He took out his ID and shook it, the metal buckle flashing under the searchlight. But you breaking into the reservation late at night, do you need me to contact the BIA, Bureau of Indian Affairs? David's smile froze for a moment. He noticed that although Hawk's right hand was in his trouser pocket, the strap on his sleeve was exposed. It was a tactical watch, usually used to tell time or send locations. What's more troublesome is that the young people at the bottom of the stairs began to whisper to each other, and Alicia's mobile phone screen flickered in her palm, as if she was sending a group message. "We're just here to remind you." David tugged at his tie and glanced at Irene. "Some secrets are safer when they're buried in the ground. For example, when Miss Cavos's grandmother disappeared in 1987, you were not so enthusiastic about checking the family tree." Irene dug her nails into her palms. She could hear the hum of her own tinnitus, mixed with the sound of a car engine in the distance. Was that Hawk's old Ford pickup? "No, it's a smaller displacement." She quickly scanned the outskirts of the tribe. The propane tanks by the campfire, the old tractor at the corner of the fence, and a stealthy glance as Alicia sent her. "Chief John, Elder." She suddenly raised her voice. "Mr. White is right. We should talk about the protests." She turned to David. "Did your surveillance capture a refrigerated truck passing through Bear Paw Valley last Wednesday?" David's pupils suddenly contracted. Hawk took the opportunity to kick the gravel at his feet with the toe of his shoe, in a rhythm of 3 long and 2 short kicks. This was the secret signal he and Jack agreed upon. 20 meters away, young police officer Jack was squatting against the side wall of the sacred tree house, with his cell phone to his ear, pretending to be on the phone, but actually recording everything David said. "Have you quarreled enough?" Elder Roberts slammed his scepter to the ground. "The genealogy is the life of the tribe. No one can—" "Look over there," Alicia suddenly screamed. The propane tank next to the bonfire was knocked over, and the blue flame shot up 2 meters high. Several young people rushed over, holding signs that read "Stop Stealing Water," and their slogans mixed with sparks shattered the night sky. David's men instinctively turned around, and one of them reached for his baton, but Alicia's cowboy boot stepped precisely on his instep. Now Hawk grabbed the chief's arm, and Irene pushed the elder to the side door of the sacred treehouse. Jack emerged from the shadows and poked the rusty door lock with a master key, a mold he had taken last week when he helped the tribe repair the fence. Inside the door was a secret room filled with animal skin rolls and birch bark files. The musty smell mixed with the scent of pine resin filled the air. On the innermost oak cabinet was a copper lock, which was the one that could be opened by the eagle bone key that the elder always held. Looking for the maternal family tree from 1987 to 1995, Erin pulled off the eagle feather pendant from her neck and used a silver chain to clear the dust on the top of the cabinet. My grandmother's missing record, and what Maggie said about the common ancestor of the missing women. Hawk locked the door of the secret room with his backhand, and through the crack in the door he saw David's men chasing the young man out of the fence. Alicia deliberately fell into the mud pit, knocking the opponent's tactical flashlight into the gutter. But when he turned around, he found Elder Robert tremblingly reaching for the key at his waist. The old man's eyes swept over the cowhide bag in the corner of the secret room, which was bulging and seemed to contain something hard. Click. The crisp sound of metal colliding made everyone freeze. The ringing in Erin's ears suddenly shrieked with the sound of some kind of lock being turned. Not the door they had just locked, but the outer door of the secret room. She rushed to the door and pushed hard, but it didn't budge. Outside, there came the sound of rubber soles rubbing against the ground, and the familiar sound of metal contracting. The sound of David's telescopic batons deploying. "They locked us up." Hawk put his hand on his pistol, but then slowly let go, remembering the rule that police officers had no right to shoot on the reservation. He looked out through the air vent on the door. In the moonlight, David was standing on the steps of the sacred treehouse, shaking a bunch of keys in his hand. His scar was twisted into a hideous arc in his smile lines. Now, his voice filtered through the door. We can talk about what should be said and what should be left unsaid forever. In the secret room, the copper lock of the oak cabinet glowed coldly in Irene's hand. Suddenly there was a sound of heavy objects colliding outside. Was it a fight between the young people from the tribe, or did David's men start banging on the door? Irene took out her cell phone to call the police, but found that there was no signal. The signal jammer was something she should have thought of earlier. Hawk tugged at his collar and sobered up. He looked at the reddened corners of Irene's eyes, and recalled her look 3 days ago when she was flipping through an old newspaper and said, "On the day my grandmother disappeared, the Western Territory had just obtained the drilling permit for Bear Claw Valley." Now the air in the secret room was becoming more and more stuffy, and the family tree in the oak cabinet was rustling, like countless pairs of eyes staring at them in the dark. "Start looking." Erin pressed the eagle feather pendant into Hawk's hand. "Even if you can only find one page." The banging sounds outside the door became more frequent. Someone shouted something, but it was muffled by the fist. Hawk took out a lighter and lit the candle on the table. The flame reflected Irene's taut jawline and the gold-plated pattern at the beginning of the family tree. That was the totem of the Cree Tree of Life. The densely packed names at the root of the tree were waiting to be searched. Seen. Click. The lock cylinder on the outer door cracked. The sound of the outer door's lock core breaking was like a steel needle piercing my eardrum. Irene's nails almost dug into her palms. She heard Elder Roberts gasp behind her. The old man who always pinned a silver cross on his deerskin waistcoat was now poking her back with his dry branch-like fingers. "I told you not to let outsiders touch the family tree. Now with those oil company dogs blocking the way outside, you're going to drag the entire tribe into the fire." "Robert." Chief John's voice was like ballast. He held the ceremonial eagle feather scepter in his hand, and his brown skin looked cool blue in the candlelight. "Let's check the door first." Hawk had already stumbled forward. His leather boots rolled over the scattered family tree pages on the ground. The force of the bang on the door was too great, and the oak cabinet was shaken to tilt. Several rolls of family trees tied with animal skin ropes fell down with a crash, revealing the yellowed pages inside. The ink on the top page had not yet dried, and it read Mary Davis's great-grandmother Lydia Cavos. Irene's breath hitched. That was her grandmother's name. The door lock is welded shut. Hawk's knuckles pressed against the door frame. The piercing sound of metal friction. They wrapped the chain around it at least 3 times from the outside. When he turned around, the police badge on his chest flashed a cold light. "There's a fight outside. It might be Jack who's stalling." Jack. Irene then remembered the young policeman who always wore his police hat askew. 2 days ago when he helped move the family tree, there were coffee stains on his cuffs, but now he was fighting against a large number of people outside the door. She took out an eagle feather pendant from her pocket. The feathers on the pendant had become hairy from being rubbed by her. It was the last thing left by her grandmother. "Vent," Mary said suddenly. The archivist, who always wears her grey hair in a bun, is squatting in the corner, tapping on a raised brick on the wall with her fingertips. "When we renovated the archives room 10 years ago, we opened a ventilation duct to prevent moisture." Her voice is trembling, but with a fierceness. "The duct leads to the back mountain. When my father built it, he cut corners and the pipe wall is thin." Irene looked up following her gesture. The vent above my head was covered with cobwebs, and the iron fence had rusted to a dark brown, with a few rays of muddy light leaking in through the gaps. She pulled off the tasseled scarf from around her waist, wrapped her hands around it, and tried to pry the fence apart. Rust fell on her wrists like a handful of broken glass. "Let me do it." Hawk squeezed over. He unbuckled his belt, and the buckle got stuck in the gap of the fence. His muscles were stretched into hard lines under his police uniform. "When I was chasing drug dealers at the border, I went through a sewer 3 times narrower than this." When he said this, he avoided Irene's eyes, and his Adam's apple moved. 3 days ago, he was drunk and said, The day I killed my partner, I also went through this broken pipe. Suddenly, Irene's eyes appeared in front of him. With a click, the fence tilted to one side. The wind that smelled moldy and pine resin blew in, causing the candle on the table to flicker. The pages of the family tree flipped rustlingly, and a page stopped at the column of missing persons in 1987. Irene saw the words Aunt Maggie Ogier, Ruth Bell, with her sharp eyes. That was the name mentioned by the female forensic doctor. Let the chief and the elders go out first. Irene tugged at Hawk's sleeve. Robert was still muttering about going against ancestral teachings, but after being glared at by John, he could only curse and step on Hawk's shoulder. Just as the old man's deerskin boots were stuffed into the vent, there was a sound of glass breaking outside. Someone shouted, "Don't let them run away," followed by Jack's muffled groan. "Hurry." Hawk pushed Mary up. The archivist's fingers scratched the pipe wall, and suddenly stopped. There are scratches on the pipe wall. Her nails scraped a certain spot. My father said that when the pipeline was built, some things can't be written in the family tree. Erin's heart skipped a beat. She moved closer with the light of Hawk's lighter, and saw crooked scratches on the pipe wall, as if they were made by a nail, with varying depths and some covered with rust. She could vaguely make out the letters: drilling, blood, and knife. "Let's get out first." Hawk's voice was very low, and the veins on the back of his hand were bulging. "Jack can't hold on for much longer." Irene was the last to crawl into the pipe. The walls of the pipe hurt her ribs, and the moldy ash made her want to cough. Robert was complaining up front that there was a smell of rotten meat in the pipe. Mary was explaining that it was due to a long-term leakage of resin. Hawk followed her, breathing so close to her ears. "Turn left, remember the third turn Mary mentioned." At this moment, the wall of the tube suddenly vibrated. Boom, boom, boom. It sounded like someone was hitting the wall with an iron rod, sometimes fast and sometimes slow. The tips of Irene's ears suddenly felt hot. That was her golden finger that could distinguish metallic sounds, sending a warning. She froze in place, and Hawk's hand grabbed her ankle in time. "What's wrong?" "It's coming from the right." She swallowed. The knocking sounded again. This time it was clearer. 3 long and 2 short. A pause, then 2 long and 1 short again. Irene recalled that when she was a child in the reservation, the old people would knock on copper basins to pass on the alarm. Hawk's Adam's apple moved, remembering that his partner used Morse code to knock on the water pipe for half a night before his death. "It's a pattern," Irene said softly. "What?" The rhythm of the percussion. Her eagle feather pendant swung in the pipe, hitting the pipe wall with a light sound, like conveying a message. Suddenly Jack's roar came from outside. "Go. They have guns." With a muffled sound, all sounds were cut off. Irene's nails dug deep into the grooves on the tube wall. She could hear her own heartbeat mixed with the regular beat. One beat, as if counting down something. Hawk's hands were still clasped on her ankles, and the warmth seeped through her jeans, reminding her of the cracks in his eyes 3 days ago when he said, "I thought I'd never hear any sound other than gunfire in my life." The knocking continued. 3 long and 2 short. Pause. 2 long and 1 short. Like some kind of code. Like a call for help. The musty smell mixed with the smell of rust from the pipe penetrated into Irene's nostrils. Her knees were pressed against the raised metal edges, and every movement was painful. Hawk's hands were still clasped around her ankles, his knuckles white from the force, like a taut rope that kept the two from falling into deeper darkness. The knocking sounded again. This time it came from the right side of the pipe wall. 3 long and 2 short. A 2-second pause, then 2 long and 1 short. Irene's eagle feather pendant swung in front of her chest, making a slight sound when it hit the pipe. The sound reminded her of the tornado that hit the reservation on a rainy night when she was 12 years old. The old people used copper basins to beat out the same rhythm and dragged her into the storm cellar while she was hiding in the tent. "Morse code," Hawk said suddenly, his breath sweeping over the back of her neck. My partner. He was shot and lying in an abandoned warehouse, his blood soaking the floor red. He used this rhythm to knock on the water pipe for half the night. His thumb unconsciously rubbed the fraying spot on her jeans, where she had been torn by barbed wire during the protest last week. I was in a car 3 kilometers away, and my headphones were full of noise. I didn't hear it. Irene's Adam's apple moved. She took out the eagle feather pendant and tapped the pipe wall lightly with the end of the silver chain, 2 short and 1 long, which was the safety code agreed upon by the children in the reservation when playing hide and seek. The knocking sound paused, and then a series of short, rapid sounds responded. "It's Alicia." Erin suddenly turned her head, her hair brushing Hawk's chin. She helped me organize materials for the protest last year. We taught tribal children to use percussion to convey simple messages. Her fingers traced the lines on the tube wall and stopped at a concave part. The metal here is thin, so it should be connected to the ventilation hole on the back wall of the archive room. Hawk's phone screen lit up a tiny slit in the darkness, and he covered the light with his palm and shone it towards the position of Irene's fingertips. Sure enough, there was an almost invisible scratch on the wall of the tube, like the mark left by repeated scratching by fingernails. "What's going on outside?" Irene tapped lightly on the wall of the pipe, 3 short taps and 1 long. This was inquiry. The answering knocks came faster, with a panicky tremor. Erin narrowed her eyes and translated the rhythm into corresponding letters in her mind. Jack was shot. David guarding the door. Her nails dug deep into her palms. Jack is injured, and David White's men are guarding the exit of the archive room. Hawk's temple was throbbing. He took out a tactical knife from his waist and knocked the pipe wall with the back of the knife. "Can you lead them away?" This time there was a little more certainty in the response. Alesha's knocks became more forceful, as if they were on solid ground. Backyard, wood, pile, oil, drum. She's going to light the pyre and cause chaos. Erin grabbed Hawk's wrist, but she has to find another exit before David's men find her. Suddenly, there was a muffled sound of a heavy object being dragged in the pipe, followed by Jack's suppressed groan. Hawk's phone screen went off, and the only sound in the darkness was the overlapping breathing of the 2 people. "George!" Irene suddenly raised her voice and shouted to the other end of the pipe. When they came in, George Wilson stayed closer to the archives to check the pipe structure. "Does the family tree mention the ventilation system of the old ancestral hall?" The sound of metal friction came closer and closer. George's reading glasses flashed in the darkness. It was written in the 1937 genealogy revision record that there was an exhaust pipe in the basement of the ancestral hall, connected to the main building to disperse incense ash. He took out a wrinkled notebook and tapped the pipe wall with his pen. "According to the coordinates, if we climb 30 meters southeast, we should be able to reach the inspection hole on the back wall of the ancestral hall." Hawk tugged at the strap of Erin's backpack. "You first." The pipe became narrower as it went forward, and Irene's shoulder armor rubbed against the pipe wall, making a harsh sound. She could hear Hawk's heavy breathing behind her, and the sound of George scraping the tip of his pen against the wall of the tube as he counted. 17, 18. When he counted to 29, there was a sudden hollow echo from the wall of the tube. Hawk used a tactical knife to pry up a piece of rusted iron plate, and the smell of mold mixed with sandalwood suddenly poured in. Irene first leaned half of her body out and saw faded totems all over the wall. The candlestick on the shrine was covered with dust, half a finger thick. There were several volumes of family tree, wrapped in deerskin, piled on the altar. On the cover of the top volume, the 3 gold-plated characters, "Cavus," were dark yellow in the dust. "Come in." She reached out to pull Hawk in, her fingertips touching the calluses on his palms. "This place looks like someone cleans it regularly." Hawk's boots made a hollow sound as they stepped on the blue bricks. He kicked away a spider web at his feet, revealing a half-buried stone brick on the ground. In the gap was a half-faded blue ribbon, exactly the same as the one Irene always pinned in her ponytail. Suddenly, knocking sounds came from above my head. 3 long and 2 short. A pause. 2 long and 1 short. Irene looked up and saw Alicia's face reflected in the vent. The girl's hair was stained with grass clippings, and her eyes were bright as stars. "They're going to the woodpile. Go quickly." In the shadow behind the shrine, the deerskin cover of a family tree trembled slightly, revealing half of a photo underneath. The woman in the photo was wearing a handmade deerskin skirt, and had an eagle feather pendant around her neck that was exactly the same as Irene's. The background was a wasteland flattened by a bulldozer, with a warning sign for energy exploration area in the distance. Hawk placed his hand on Erin's lower back and pushed her towards the shrine. Sandalwood mixed with dust floated in the air. From somewhere came the sound of wooden boards cracking, as if something had finally woken up from its deep sleep. When the wooden door of the old ancestral hall creaked closed behind her, goosebumps appeared on the back of Irene's neck. The scent of sandalwood mixed with aged pine resin penetrated her nostrils, and she realized that the bronze incense burner on the altar was filled with half-burned wormwood, exactly the same as the one used to purify houses during the Day of the Dead on the reservation every year. "Smith, guard the door." Hawk's boot heel rolled over a loose blue brick, making a hollow echo. His right hand remained on the holster at his waist, and his left hand took out a tactical flashlight, sweeping the beam across the faded mural. The totem of the flapping wings of the Thunderbird has not been renovated in at least 70 years. Young police officer Jack Smith immediately stood with his back against the door, his badge glowing coldly in the dim light. "Do you want me to check the attic?" The girl in the ventilation duct just now said that someone was heading towards the woodpile. Maybe they were trying to divert the patrol? "Don't alert the enemy yet." Hawk's beam stopped at a half-finger-wide crack on the side of the shrine. The blue ribbon stuck in the crack swayed gently in the breeze. "Kavos, come and take a look at this." Irene's breathing suddenly hitched. The color of the blue ribbon had faded into washed blue, but the overlock stitch on the edge, 3 up and 1 down backstitch, was sewn by her own hands using the old sewing machine left by her grandmother. She squatted down, and just as her fingertips were about to touch the ribbon, George Wilson suddenly exclaimed, "My God, these buckskin rolls." The genealogist was half kneeling in front of a dusty altar, his gloved hand hovering over a pile of deerskin envelopes. His gold-rimmed glasses were covered with a thin layer of dust, but his eyes behind the lenses were surprisingly bright. The census records of 1897, the marriage contract of 1923. "Miss Kavos, look at this." He opened the top volume, and on the yellowed deerskin was written in charcoal pencil, Cree, Bear Claw Clan. "It is exactly the same as the totem on your family emblem." Irene's fingers unconsciously clenched the corner of her clothes. The words my mother said when she combed her hair for the last time before she disappeared 5 years ago suddenly rang in my ears. "Remember, our roots are in the deerskin rolls, in the cracks in the bricks of the old ancestral hall." A soft click sound interrupted the memories. Hawk shone his tactical flashlight on the wall, and the light passed over a row of blurred marks. "Are these symbols the same as the ones you saw in the reservation museum?" Irene moved closer to the wall. The marks were blackened by smoke, but one could tell they were made with a bone knife. The tip was rounded, and was a tool used exclusively by witch doctors in the tribe. She extended her index finger and traced the lines. The touch was as rough as sandpaper. The tail feathers of the thunderbird, the claw marks of the wolf. "Is this a migration route map?" Before she finished speaking, her fingertips suddenly stopped. "Wait, this symbol." "What's wrong?" Hawk's voice softened, as if he were approaching a frightened deer. "This is the Eye of Oblivion." Erin's throat tightened. "When I was a child, I heard stories from elders that the tribe would carve this symbol at the entrance to important secrets. A closed eye with eyelashes that were upside-down thorns. My mother said that only when the memory in the blood is awakened, the eyes will open. George suddenly poked his head out from behind the altar. Miss Carvos, look at this. He held up a yellowed photo. The warning sign, energy exploration area. In the background hurt people's eyes. On the back of the photo it says Mary Carvos. Spring 1985. The same year engraved on your eagle feather pendant. Erin's breathing almost stopped. She took out the pendant from her neck and found that the silver eagle feather was indeed engraved with 1985 and 317, which was the day of family rebirth that her mother had mentioned. The woman in the photo is wearing a handmade deerskin skirt, and the pendant around her neck is exactly the same as hers, and the wasteland beneath her feet clearly matches the report on the composition of the sand in the stomach of the third body found in the refrigerated truck case. That is the red shale that can only be found in the unsupervised corridor along the US-Canada border. Secret compartment.
Hawk suddenly knocked on the wall with the butt of his gun.
His tactical flashlight moved along the symbol that Erin had traced, and the beam stopped at the location of the Eye of Oblivion. The echo here is different. Jack immediately leaned over and tapped the wall with his palm. When he knocked on the third brick below the eye, there was a hollow muffled sound. There is a mezzanine. Irene's heartbeat roared in her ears. She recalled the rainy night before her mother disappeared, and she had murmured to the eagle feather pendant on the fireplace, "Remember, the bricks of the old ancestral hall can speak." She trembled as she pressed the pendant in the center of her eye, and a slight click sound was heard when the metal touched the stone wall. The moment the secret compartment was opened, the musty smell, mixed with the sour smell of paper pages, rushed out. There were more than 24 neatly stacked brown paper notebooks with missing persons record 1978-2020 written on the cover in faded blue ink. Erin opened the most recent one, and a familiar name popped up on the first page. Alicia Bell, May 12, 2023, last seen at boundary marker 3 on the US-Canada border. Carvos, Hawk suddenly shouted. His tactical flashlight had gone out, and he leaned his back against the wall, listening to the noise outside the door. Only then did Irene realize that the chirping of insects outside the ancestral hall had suddenly disappeared at some point. Jack's hand was already on the intercom. "I'll go check it out. Don't move." Hawk's voice was like a steel knife tempered with ice. He fished out a spare magazine from his boot. The click of the quick reload was particularly clear in the silence. There are at least 6 people wearing hard-soled boots and walking in unison. He looked at Irene, his eyes sweeping over the notebook in her hand. "They are here for these." George's fingers crumpled the deerskin roll. "Could it be Elder Robert?" he said. "No matter who it is." Hawk pushed Irene and George towards the secret compartment. "Smith, guard the secret compartment. Carvos, take the notebook. Move fast. The footsteps are approaching." Irene could hear her own rapid breathing hitting her chest, like beating a broken drum. When the first crisp sound of boot heels hitting blue stone slabs was heard, Hawk suddenly pulled out the blue ribbon from her ponytail and tied it to the bronze incense burner in front of the shrine, exactly the same half as the one in the brick gap. "That's what they're looking for." He ran his thumb across the top of her hair. A distraction. The footsteps outside the ancestral hall stopped at the gate of the courtyard. Someone said something in a low voice, and Irene couldn't hear it clearly, but a familiar smell wafted on the wind. The smell of Cuban cigars that David White often used. Hawk's fingers pushed gently at the small of her back. As she turned around holding the notebook, she caught a glimpse of the deerskin scroll behind the shrine, suddenly flipping over, and a photo slipped out and fell on the blue bricks. In the wasteland in the photo, a new warning sign of energy exploration area has been erected, with the date April 15, 2023, the time of death of the first female corpse in the refrigerated truck. With a click, the wooden door was pushed open.
Hawk's gun had been pulled out, and the slight sound of the safety bolt was like a fine needle
piercing the silence in the ancestral hall. The moss in the cracks of the blue bricks was crushed into fine green juice by the heels, and Irene could hear the sour sound of her back teeth biting. Hawk's palm was still pressing on her lower back, and the heat seeped in through her thin shirt like a piece of red-hot iron. It reminded her of the copper kettle that was knocked over at the bonfire party in the reservation when she was 12 years old. The same burning pain, the same burning gap in her awakening in fear. "Jack, move the altar next to the shrine." Hawk's voice was as low as sand, scraping against the barrel of a gun. "Elder Robert, you and the chief go behind the pile of junk on the side wall. George, untie the hemp rope under the incense burner." The blue ribbon he pulled off from Irene's hair was still warm, but now he had already walked around to the side of the shrine, tapping quickly on the mottled wooden beams with his fingertips. The beams of the old ancestral hall are hollow. When they come in later, they will trip over the rope and
bang!
The moment the wooden door was kicked open, Irene's ears suddenly exploded. It was the squeal of contracting metal, the same sound as when a refrigerated truck engine starts up. She saw 3 men in black tactical uniforms filing in. The first one had a piece of cartilage missing from his right ear, the same man who had trampled her protest sign into the mud at the gas station last week. Looking for Blue Ribbon, the man with the missing ears took out the walkie-talkie. Mr. White said that the woman Kavos brought the family tree records. Hawk's toes twitched slightly. The hemp rope George had just untied hung from the rafters, with half a brick under the altar tied to the end. As soon as the earless man's leather boots rolled over the knot, the beams let out a dying groan. Irene watched the bronze lampstand on the shrine, the faded deerskin roll, and even the stone statue with half its face cracked, fall down along with the hollowed-out wooden beams. "Be careful," the man with missing ears yelled. But it was too late. The altar fell at his feet, and wood chips splashed all over the room. The stone statue brushed the second security guard's temple and fell into the blue brick floor, leaving a hole the size of a fist. The worst happened to the third one, who was pierced in the shoulder by a copper arrow that slipped out of the deerskin roll. He rolled on the ground holding his arm in pain. Side door. Hawk grabbed Irene's wrist and ran behind the shrine, while Jack protected the 2 old men and broke open the rotten wooden door. Irene's notebook hit the door frame. She heard the photos inside slide out, but she didn't dare to stop. She heard the deaf man roar from behind her. "Chase them. If you dare to let them get away, you'll all go to Texas to dig for oil. The night is like a ball of wet cotton on your face." George's shadow swayed quickly in front. He stepped on the sage that was half a person's height, and turned back to shout, "Follow me closely." 30 years ago, I walked along this drainage ditch to find the lost sheep for the old chief. Irene's hiking boots sank into the mud. Hawk grabbed her wrist with his backhand and pulled her up the slope with his arm strength. She heard a dog barking behind her. It was David White's Rottweiler, and the barking smelled of blood. "Turn left." George suddenly dodged into a pine bush. "There's an abandoned water tower ahead. Their car can't get in." By the time everyone fell into the bottom floor of the water tower, Irene's shirt was soaked with cold sweat. Jack held his knees and panted, his Adam's apple rolling up and down. How did they know we were in the ancestral hall? Hawk leaned against the rusty water pipe, his fingers unconsciously stroking the handle of the gun. Irene knew it was a sign of his post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. He had been stroking his gun like that at the border last winter, misjudging the location of the drug dealers, and getting his partner hit by a stray bullet. Someone leaked the secret. He suddenly spoke, his eyes sweeping over Chief John and Elder Robert. "Only you two have the key to the genealogy room." The air froze instantly. Chief John's buckskin vest was torn, revealing a gray t-shirt with veteran printed on it. "Hawk, our tribe has lost 17 girls. Look at this." George suddenly opened Irene's notebook, and a photo slipped out. It was the photo of the fallen wasteland in the ancestral hall. He pointed at the blurred license plate at the edge of the photo. April 15th, 2023. Energy Exploration Area. On the same day, the first female corpse was loaded into a refrigerated truck. He pulled out a few pages of family tree records. The last place where the missing 17 girls appeared was a convenience store on Highway 10, and the freight company on Highway 10 is called Swift Cold Chain. Irene's tinnitus started again. This time it was not the sound of an engine, but the crisp sound of metal chains colliding. She remembered seeing 3 white refrigerated trucks at the intersection of the reservation last week. The Swift Cold Chain logo on the truck body was half covered with mud. But the engine sound, she suddenly grabbed Hawk's arm. I've heard their engine. It's a Cummins ISX-50. The metal contraction sound is 2 scales higher than that of ordinary trucks. So White is anxious to get the genealogical records. Hawk's thumb rubbed over the exploration area warning sign on the photo. He needs to confirm the ancestry of the missing so that their accidents can be attributed to the natural loss of the reservation population. In Swift Cold Chain, he raised his head, the bloodshot in his eyes like a cracked spiderweb. Is the truck that transports these natural losses. The roar of a car engine came from the distance, getting closer and closer. George peeked out through the broken window of the water tower. 2 pickup trucks, heading east, probably to block the highway. He closed his notebook. To check Swift Cold Chain, we have to go to their transfer station in Tucson. But that place, how many security guards are there? Hawk interrupted. 12-hour shifts, 4 fixed posts, 2 patrol posts. George took out his cell phone and called up the satellite map. There is a drainage hole in the back wall, but barbed wire was added last month. That's enough. Hawk put the gun back into his waist and turned around with a gust of wind. We'll be near the transfer station before daybreak. Irene, you'll be responsible for listening to the engine sound to confirm the target vehicle. Jack, check their freight manifest. George and I, his eyes swept across the dimming car lights in the distance. We have to make White's people think we're still in the north. Irene tied the blue ribbon back into her hair. The wind blew through the cracks in the water tower, bringing with it a faint smell of cigars. She touched the photo in her notebook. The warning sign for the exploration area glowed coldly in the moonlight, like a tombstone. The neon sign of Shenji Cold Chain should also be lit on a night like this, right? She thought, and there lies the secret of the final journey of 17 girls. At 2:17 in the morning, as Hawk's pickup truck rolled over the gravel road outside Tucson, and the headlights swept across the rusty iron gate of Swift Cold Chain, Irene heard the sound of her Adam's apple rolling. She wrapped the blue ribbon around her knuckles 3 times, an old habit she had when she was anxious, since her mother disappeared on the reservation when she was 13. Carl Harris. Jack lowered his voice and pointed the telescope at the gate. The security captain was checking the flashlights of patrolling security guards with his hands behind his back, and the heels of his leather boots made crisp sounds on the concrete floor. George said he just got out of the army last month, but judging by his behavior now, he seems to be still on duty in Afghanistan. Hawk parked the car at an abandoned gas station half a kilometer away, and his hand stroking the holster was reflected in the rearview mirror. Irene knew that he was not nervous. He would confirm the location of the Glock 17 before each action, as if he was talking to a dead colleague. 4 fixed posts and 2 patrol posts. He repeated George's intelligence, his eyes sweeping over the barbed wire at the top of the wall. The drainage outlet on the back wall has a sensor device, and the surveillance at the main gate covers 30 meters. But Lucy said. Irene's words were cut off by a sound of metallic friction. She tilted her ear and heard the unique hum of a refrigerated truck compressor in the wind, 2 notes higher than that of an ordinary truck. It was the model she had heard at the crime scene. East Warehouse, 3rd row. She pointed to the shadow under the neon light. The target vehicle is there. Hawk's brows twitched. He was about to speak when he saw the side door in the corner of the wall open a crack, and a figure wrapped in a fluorescent yellow vest slipped out with a bulging garbage bag in his hand. Cleaner. Jack adjusted the focus of the telescope. The name tag says L. Martin, Lucy Martin. Erin's fingers loosened the blue ribbon. She remembered George mentioning this name. Lucy worked the night shift every Wednesday, responsible for cleaning up the waste paper in the finance office. Last month, when she was taking out the trash, a waybill with bloody fingerprints stuck to the bottom of a coffee cup, which she secretly put into her apron pocket. "I'll go." She opened the car door, and the night wind blew her hair across her collarbone. Hawk wanted to stop her, but she stopped him with a look. A social worker's intuition is more effective than a gun, especially when facing a woman who always holds a garbage bag to her chest. Lucy's garbage bag rustled at her feet. When she looked up and saw Irene, her pupils shrank to the point of pins, until she said Nisito, "Hello," in Cree. She relaxed a little. "How did you know?" "My grandmother was a Cree woman who made baskets in the Yukon." Erin pointed to the blue ribbon in her hair. "The embroidery on your apron is the same as what she taught me." Lucy looked down at the edge of her mended apron, where a clover was embroidered crookedly. Her fingers suddenly clenched the garbage bag, her knuckles turning white. "Are you the police, looking for missing people?" Irene spoke slowly, as if she were trying to comfort a frightened deer. 17 girls, all on the last leg of their journey in a swift car. Lucy's Adam's apple moved. In the distance came the voice of Carl scolding the patrolling security guard. "Shine the flashlight on the corner. Rats have sharper eyes than you." She thrust the garbage bag at Irene and lowered her voice. "The finance office is at the eastern end of the second floor. The door is a combination lock and will be reset at 3. There was a shipping note in the garbage, and the consignee was written as Aurora Energy. My husband worked in the oil field, and the company's drilling platforms were always near the indigenous reservation. Why help us?" "My daughter." Lucy's voice suddenly trembled. She said last week that she was going to Phoenix to visit her cousin, and she hasn't answered the phone since then. She tore off her work badge and handed it to Irene, turned around to leave, and then turned back to add, "The side door shift changes at 3 o'clock, and the security guard will go to the cafeteria to smoke, just for 10 minutes. Hawk listened to the retelling, turned the bottle in his palm twice, and stuffed it back into the car's storage box. "Jack, pretend to be FedEx and deliver the urgent item to the front desk." He patted the young man on the shoulder. "Remember to stick the waybill crooked. The more they scold you, the more distracted they will be." Jack's Adam's apple moved, and he took out his wrinkled courier uniform and put it on. "If I'm recognized, they said you were a fresh graduate, and a dumb one." Hawk tugged at his cowboy hat. "So dumb they didn't bother to check your ID." At 302, Jack's express truck stopped at the main gate on time. Just as the security guard was about to scold him, he bumped into the gatekeeper holding the cardboard box, and the waybill fell to the ground. "Sorry, I'm sorry." The manager said this order must be delivered before 3 o'clock. Carl's curse exploded. "Idiot, don't you have eyes?" He kicked the waybill away and bent down to pick it up, when Hawk and Irene had already crouched and slipped into the side door. The door of the finance office was ajar. Irene turned on the flashlight on her phone in the dark, and when the beam of light swept across the table, she gasped. There was a stack of waybills stuffed at the bottom of the filing cabinet, and the delivery addresses were all outside the reserved area, and the remarks column was written in red pen. No identity. "Look at this." Hawk held up a photo. The background was a drilling platform in the desert, and in the foreground stood 3 men in work clothes. One of them had a name tag that read Swift Cold Chain Carl Harris. Suddenly, footsteps were heard coming from the corridor. Irene quickly turned off the flashlight, and in the darkness, she could hear her own pounding heart. "Who's in there?" Carl's voice sounded like ice, and the beam of flashlight pierced through the crack in the door. Hawk stuffed the photo into his trouser pocket and headed for the door. "Border Patrol, Reyes." He raised his voice deliberately. "We're investigating the refrigerated truck with 17 bodies. We have evidence that—" "Bullshit!" Carl's gun was already pointed at Hawk's chest. You broke into my house. I can now.
What can you do?
Hawk stared at the other's trembling fingers. Kill the police? Then explain why the drilling rig photo was in the finance room. Why do the numbers of no identity on the waybill match the number of missing Aboriginal girls? Carl's temple throbbed. At the end of the corridor, a security guard shouted, "Captain, there is something wrong with the courier at the front desk. The waybill is fake." The muzzle of his gun deflected slightly. Hawk took the opportunity to push him away with his shoulder and dragged Irene towards the stairs. Carl roared from behind, "Seal all exits. If alive, I must see you. If dead." A crisp sound interrupted his words. Irene turned around the corner of the stairs and saw Carl's intercom fell to the ground. A vague electric sound came out of it, mixed with a clear sentence. The oil field said that it must be cleaned up tonight. The sensor lights in the stairwell flickered with his running footsteps. Hawk's leather heels tapped on the metal steps, and every step felt like a knock on his nerves. The hem of Irene's windbreaker brushed against his wrist, and her rapid breathing mixed with the gradually approaching footsteps downstairs, weaving a dense net in the enclosed space.
The third door on the right. Hawk suddenly grabbed Irene's arm and pushed her into the shadow of the fire escape.
Through the gap between the handrails of the stairs, he caught a glimpse of a tall, thin man in a grey suit standing at the door of the finance office. Peter Anderson. His gold-rimmed glasses had slipped to the tip of his nose, and he was holding a black USB flash drive in his hand, moving towards the elevator. That was the figure I saw on the gas station surveillance camera last week. Hawk remembered it clearly. At 2:17 in the morning, Peter's silver Lexus was parked in the refrigerated truck unloading area, with half a piece of blue waterproof cloth exposed in the trunk, and the pattern was exactly the same as the shroud at the scene of the body being dumped. They tracked Carl and the others to the second floor. Hawk pulled off the police badge from his waist and shook it, his knuckles pressing against Irene's lower back. 5 minutes at most. Irene's pupils shrank to pinpoints. She looked at the fierceness in Hawk's eyes, the light he would have when he was tracking smugglers in the desert. "Don't die before me, old drunkard." She cursed at the top of her voice, turned around and broke open the security door, deliberately sounding the fire alarm. Amid the shrill buzzing, she heard the sound of Hawk's leather boots scraping across the ground, like a suddenly tense hunting wolf. By the time Peter's shoes slipped on the marble in the hallway, Hawk was already on the back of his neck. The man's cold sweat oozed down his collar, mixed with the sweet smell of cologne. Border Patrol. Hawk locked Peter's throat with his arm, and pressed his thumb on the numbness of his wrist. The code for the secret door in the finance office. "Tell me now." "You can't." "Can't what?" Hawk said with more force, and Peter's gold-rimmed glasses fell to the ground with a smack. "Can't you put you and the waybill of 17 bodies together? Can't you let the FBI check your Swiss account transactions?" He glimpsed a half-bank statement sticking out of Peter's suit pocket and sneered. "Or are you more afraid of letting your daughter know that among the frozen beef her father helped to transport, there was an Aboriginal girl of her age?" Peter's knees suddenly gave way. Hawk used his force to push the man against the door of the finance office, and listened to him crying out the password. The moment the metal lock bolt popped out, Hawk kicked the door open and threw Peter into a room full of documents. The finance room was smaller than Hawk had imagined. Faded annual reports were piled in the corner, and there was a photo frame on the windowsill. The photo showed a little girl with pigtails. She must be Peter's daughter. Hawk didn't bother to look any further. He kicked the swivel chair away, grabbed Peter's tie and pointed to the safe. "Open."
That's the general manager's private locker. Peter's fingers trembled on the combination dial. "I don't have the authority."
At 10 p.m. last Wednesday, you used the general manager's work card to swipe open the B area warehouse. Hawk took out a photo from his trouser pocket and slapped it on the table. It was a screenshot from the gas station's surveillance camera. The waybill number is XJ479, and the consignee is Polaris Energy. Right? He bent down to pick up Peter's USB drive and inserted it into the computer. Now either you open it, or I will let all the media in Arizona know tomorrow morning that Miss Peter Anderson's little daughter used the blood of an indigenous girl to pay for her tuition. The safe opened with a click. Hawk's breathing suddenly hitched. A stack of blue ledgers lay on the velvet lining, and the words "Transportation Cost Accounting" printed on the cover had been painted blood red with a marker. He opened the first book, and the top note was still stained with ink. November 2nd, 12 people, 70% of Polaris's advance payment received. December 15 people. The oil field reported cleaned up, and the balance was settled. When Irene broke in, Hawk was taking pictures of the third account book with his mobile phone. There was a lump on her left cheek, and the sleeves of her jacket were torn, but she held up the intercom she had snatched from the security guard. Carl and 6 security guards are gathering on the first floor. The elevator is locked, and there are 2 people guarding the emergency staircase. She glanced at the account book spread out on the table, and her pupils suddenly contracted. These are enough to send them to hell. Hawk snapped the last few pages into his phone and stuffed the account book back into the safe as it was. He ripped off his tie and tied Peter's hands and feet, and put his suit jacket over his head. 10 minutes ago, Carl said on the intercom, "The oil field will be cleaned up tonight. They may want to destroy the body. What are you waiting for?" Irene grabbed the USB on the table and stuffed it into her bra. Run! She was interrupted by the loud bang of a metal door being smashed open. Carl's face turned purple. He held a gun in his right hand, and a rubber stick in his left. There were 6 security guards standing behind him, 2 of whom were holding riot shields, blocking the door tightly. "Hand over your stuff." He flicked his gun back and forth between Hawk and Irene. "Otherwise I'll make you end up like those Indian bitches." "Bitch?" Irene suddenly laughed. She deliberately cursed in Cree, and then switched back to English. "When your mom was a cleaner on the reservation, didn't she teach you to respect people?" She took a half step forward, her heel rolling over Peter's glasses. "Or are you afraid that we will give the video of you helping Polaris bury the body to the media?" At 3 a.m. last Thursday, in the alley behind the warehouse in Area B, the guy in the leather jacket. "Shut up." Carl's gun barrel hit Irene hard on the forehead. Blood flowed down her eyebrows, drawing a red line on her pale face. Hawk's temples were throbbing as he recalled the rainy night 3 years ago when his colleague Mark was shot in the chest by a drug dealer. And there was a similar blood line. "Throw the phone and USB drive over here." Carl pointed the gun at Hawk's heart. "Or I'll—" "Captain," a security guard shouted from the stairwell. "There's movement at the toilet window on the second floor." Carl's eyes flickered. Hawk took the opportunity to drag Irene back to the safe. With the cold metal touching her back, he could hear Irene's rapid breathing behind his ears and feel her hands shaking as she held the USB drive. And right in front of them, the shadows of 6 security guards overlapped on the ground to form a net. And Carl's gun was always pointed steadily at his heart. The clock in the finance office struck 8. Hawk looked at the setting sun outside the window, and suddenly remembered what Irene said this morning. The souls of those girls are still floating on the border. They are waiting for an answer. Now the answer is in his phone. But can they take the answer out alive? Carl's finger tightened on the trigger. The fluorescent lights in the finance office buzzed overhead, and Hawk could smell the smell of rust mixed with the blood oozing from Irene's forehead. The barrel of Carl's gun was still 2 fingers below his collarbone. 6 security guards formed a semicircle like hounds, and their rubber-soled shoes made a crunching sound on the tiles. Was that the footsteps in the alley behind the warehouse in Area B at 3 o'clock in the morning last Thursday? He suddenly remembered what Peter Anderson had said the night before, as he drank his 3rd glass of tequila. The big guys would rather bury their secrets at the bottom of the Colorado River than let a single word of them leak into the news. "The locator is in my right back pocket." Hawk's voice was like sandpaper rubbing against iron, and he deliberately made the tail tone tremble. As long as my heart stops, the signal will be automatically sent to the Phoenix Police Department and the Arizona Star's encrypted mailbox. He felt the safe texture on his back poking his spine. Irene's fingers quietly hooked on his belt. Was she confirming that the USB flash drive was still against his skin? Her hands had trembled in the same way, her nails almost digging into his wrists, when they had dug out the yellowed stack of shipping bills in the attic of the old church on the reservation 3 days ago. Carl's Adam's apple moved. The 1.9-meter tall security captain has a scar on his left cheek from his brow to his chin. Hawk remembered when he checked his file this morning that the scar was left by a shooting at the US-Mexico border in 2018, the same year as Mark's accident. At this moment, the muscles under the scar were twitching, and the barrel of the gun shifted slightly by 2 centimeters. Take 2 steps back. Carl gritted his teeth and roared, and the shadows of the security guards shrank into a circle on the ground. Irene's breath sprayed behind his ear, with the aftertaste of mint candy. She always chewed Trident when she was anxious, just like he always touched the empty wine bottle in his pocket when he was anxious. Hawk took the opportunity to hook the toe of his shoe on the swivel chair leg beside him. The metal leg made a sharp sound on the ground, startling the nearest security guard so much that he shrank his shoulders. When the wall clock struck 8, Carl's cell phone vibrated in his pocket. The moment he answered the phone, the skin under the scar suddenly turned pale. "Yes, I understand." He hung up the phone and pushed the barrel of the gun back to Hawk's heart, this time with such force that it almost pierced the flesh. The top management changed their minds. They said that instead of letting you die here with the locator, they would rather send you to the police station and accuse you of stealing the company's account books. Irene suddenly laughed, and drops of blood dripped down her chin onto the front of Hawk's police uniform. "Stealing the account book?" Her voice was like a dagger tempered with ice. "The password to the safe in your finance office is Peter's daughter's birthday, right?" He said this in the bar last month, when he was drunk, on March 15th, 1997. She tilted her head and looked at Carl, the blood on her forehead stretched into a red rope. "Why don't you let your men check the safe now?" In addition to the ledger, there were 3 boxes of numbered receipts for refrigerant, the same type used on refrigerated trucks. Carl's pupils suddenly contracted. Hawk could feel his hand holding the gun shaking, not from anger, but from fear. 3 years ago, before Mark was shot, the drug dealer's hands were shaking like this. Hawk mistook it for hesitation, and Mark's blood splattered half of his face. "He won't misjudge this time. Tell your men to put away their guns." Hawk lowered his voice, as if coaxing a frightened police dog. "We will go to the police station with you, but the USB drive and mobile phone must remain with me. Otherwise, when the judge asks us to present evidence, you won't even have a chance to defend yourself." He could hear Irene whispering in Cree behind him. It was a blessing spell taught by her grandmother, and the syllables sounded like the collision of gravel in a mountain stream. Carl stared at him for a full 20 seconds, and the second hand moved 20 ticks on the wall clock. Finally, he waved his hand, and the guard's holster buckles clicked in turn. Hawk felt Irene's fingers pinch the small of his back, the signal they'd agreed upon when they were tracking poachers in the reserve forest. "Get ready. Let's go." Carl poked Hawk's back with the barrel of his gun. "Lead the way." The setting sun cut the shadow of the window frame into pieces and sprinkled them on Irene's bloody face.
Hawk walked forward, counting the gaps between the floor tiles. The 7th, the 8th, the 9th. There was a shallow dent there, which he discovered this morning when he was squatting at the door of the finance office smoking. It was left when the safe was moved. He suddenly staggered. His right foot stepped accurately into the dent, and his body leaned backward. "Be careful," Irene screamed and rushed over, the weight of both of them pressing down on the security guard behind him. Hawk's right hand reached into his trouser pocket like lightning, and the screen of his cell phone lit up in the chaos. He didn't have any locator at all. It was a children's watch he bought for $50 in the second-hand market last week,
and the positioning function had been disabled 3 months ago. But at this moment, he deliberately turned the screen towards Carl, and the blue light cast ghost images on the security guards' faces. The signal has been sent. Hawk panted and held the phone in front of Carl. Even if you kill us now, the police will rush in within 10 minutes. Carl's scar was twitching, and this time he was really panicked. He took a half step back and knocked over the filing cabinet in the corner, causing brown paper bags to scatter all over the floor like snowflakes. Hawk glimpsed the Northern Energy logo on the top sheet, the same one on the side of the refrigerated truck, the same company that had been illegally drilling near the reservation the year Irene's great-grandmother disappeared. "Take him away," Carl yelled until his voice became hoarse. 2 security guards held Hawk's arms, and the other 2 grabbed Irene's wrists. The USB drive was still in Hawk's pocket, hot against his skin. Irene's blood dripped onto the back of his hand, like a string of dying sparks. As they were pushed out the door, Hawk heard Irene say in a voice that only he could hear, "Remember what my grandmother said? On that stormy night 3 years ago, the old woman showed him the family tree by the campfire. On the yellowed pages, there were 19 names circled in red pen. The souls of the Cree will not disappear. They will become the wind, the sand, and every stone at your feet." When the clock in the finance office struck 9, Hawk stepped over the pile of scattered files. The bottom one floated up, and he saw the date on it clearly. May 17th, 2021. The day when Irene's cousin disappeared. The security guard's rubber-soled shoes made a dull sound in the corridor, like some giant beast about to wake up and turn over. Hawk looked at the emergency exit sign at the corner ahead, the red light casting a shadow on Irene's face. He touched the empty wine bottle in his pocket, and the glass shards hurt his palm. He found it in the backyard of the truck company this morning. The bottle mouth still smelled of turpentine, exactly the same as the preservative in the refrigerated truck. "We're here." Carl's voice was like rusty gears. "Get in the car." Hawk looked up and saw a black business car parked outside with dark film on the rear window. Irene's nails dug into his palms, this time not as a signal, but as a sign of fear. He remembered how she had stood in front of the refrigerated truck this morning, her breath condensing into white mist in the cold air. And she said, "I'm going to dig these girls' names out of hell one by one." Now they were being pushed into the entrance to hell. When the door to the business car opened, Hawk smelled the odor of turpentine. The clock in the finance office had just struck 9 when Hawk's leather shoes rolled over a yellowed file paper. When the bottom one floated up, he caught a glimpse of May 17th, 2021 in the date column, and his Adam's apple moved violently. That was the day when Irene's cousin Lydia last appeared in the church on the reservation. "Hurry up." Carl pressed his palm heavily on the back of his neck. The muffled sound of the security guard's rubber-soled shoes echoed in the corridor, just like the sound of sand hitting armored vehicles before last year's desert storm. Hawk touched the empty wine bottle in his pocket, and the glass shards pricked his palm, and a smell of turpentine mixed with the faint cedar scent in Irene's hair twisted into a thorn in his nostrils. The commercial vehicle was parked in the unloading area, and the dark film on the rear window looked like a solidified blood clot. Irene's nails dug into his palm, and this time it was not the watch out to the right signal they had agreed upon, but a real tremor. He remembered how she had stood in front of the refrigerated truck this morning, her breath condensing into white mist in the sub-zero air, saying, "I'm going to dig these girls' names out of hell, one by one." But now they were being pushed into hell's throat. "Captain Carl, dispatch said Car 3 needs to be refueled." The sudden male voice made Hawk's head snap up. A man in a dark green truck uniform stood at the corner holding a gas receipt, his hat brim pulled down low, with brown oil stains on his exposed chin. It was Frank Thompson, the veteran driver who had won the on-time delivery award for 3 consecutive years in the morning newspaper. Hawk remembered that when he checked the vehicle dispatch list this morning, Frank's name always appeared frequently on the No Man's Corridor route after the 15th of each month. Frank's eyes swept across the file bag in Hawk's arm, and then fell on the red corners of Irene's eyes. The driver, who always puts safety first, suddenly stopped, and the gas receipt rustled in his white-knuckled hands. Hawk noticed a fresh stain of refrigerant at the knee of his overalls, the same corrosion marks on the lining of the refrigerated car. "What's it to you?" Carl pulled Hawk's arm impatiently, and the rubber stick slapped against his palm. Irene suddenly opened her voice like a screwdriver splitting iron. "We are looking for a missing Aboriginal girl. The black account is in this bag. The waybill dated May 17th, 2021. Your wife Mathilde's cousin also disappeared on that day." Frank's hat brim shot up. Hawk saw his pupils shrink. That was the look that bereaved men had at the wake on the reservation last month. Irene pressed the issue. "Every time you drive by Tien Shui Creek at night and hear the unusual noise coming from a refrigerated truck, have you ever thought that it wasn't beef?" The truck driver's Adam's apple moved. Hawk thought of the maintenance record he had found this morning. Frank's truck had its condenser replaced 4 times in 3 months, and each time the note was abnormal temperature. At this moment Frank's eyes swept across the walkie-talkie on Carl's waist, and then fell on the fire hydrant at the end of the unloading area, and his knuckles pinched wrinkles on the gas receipt. "Alert! Smoke alarm at East Warehouse." A shrill buzzing sound suddenly exploded. Hawk saw Carl's face darken instantly. That was Jack's work. This guy was squatting in the convenience store across from the truck company this morning. He modified the old walkie-talkie given by Hawk into a signal jammer, and said he wanted to perform a sneak attack of the desert rattlesnake for the old birds. At this moment, the security guards at the end of the corridor were in chaos, and 2 new rookies even pulled out electric batons. Frank suddenly stumbled towards the security guard closest to Hawk. "Fuck. Did you open your eyes?" The security guard cursed and went to help. Hawk took the opportunity to push the other one away with his shoulder. When he threw the file bag to Irene, he heard her whisper, "Follow me closely." Carl's rubber stick rubbed Hawk's ear and hit the wall, and lime powder fell on the back of his neck, just like the temperature of his colleague's brain mixed with rain splashing on his collar when he was hit by a stray bullet on a rainy night last year. "Don't let them get away." Carl's roar drowned out the alarm. Hawk dragged Irene into the cargo storage area. Boxes of Western selected beef were stacked between the rusty shelves, but he knew that under those cartons there must be the same turpentine smell as the inner wall of the refrigerated truck. Frank threw a wrench from behind and hit the knee of the security guard who was chasing him most closely. The man fell into the loading pallet howling. The moment the cardboard box burst open, Hawk caught a glimpse of long black hair exposed inside. It was not beef, but a human body wrapped in plastic sheeting.
"This way!" Irene pulled him into the pipe layer under the loading and unloading platform.
The smell of mold and turpentine suddenly became strong. Hawk reached for the glass shards in his pocket and felt something warm at his fingertips. It was Irene's blood. She had cut herself when she bumped into the shelf. There were footsteps above the pipe, and Carl's panting was like a broken bellows. "Search carefully, alive or dead." The voice suddenly stopped. Hawk heard the sound of metal rubbing. It was Irene's golden finger moving. She could identify the engine model by the sound of metal contraction. At this moment she was sticking to the pipe to listen to the movement above. 4 patrol cars, she lowered her voice. "Carl has mobilized the outer security. We are surrounded between the cold storage and the maintenance workshop." The footsteps overhead suddenly became more frequent. Hawk felt the pepper spray pinned to Irene's lower back. It was the amulet that the old ladies had forced upon her during the protest on the reservation last week. Irene's fingers clasped his wrist, and the blood on her palms dyed the glass shards dark red. "Remember what we said at the border. Gotta dig these names out of hell." "Dig it out," Hawk repeated, his throat tight. The vent at the end of the pipe layer was suddenly covered by a shadow. It was Carl's shadow. He saw the man raise his gun, and the sound of the metal firing pin was particularly clear amid the alarm. "Run." Irene's scream was mixed with the sharp sound of glass shards cutting through the air. Hawk dragged her in the opposite direction. Behind him he could hear the security guards cursing and the sparks of bullets hitting the pipes. The door of the maintenance workshop was only 10 meters away, but 6 security guards suddenly rushed out from the corner, and their rubber sticks made a whistling sound as they scratched overhead. Irene's pepper spray hit the nearest person's eyes. The man covered his face and knocked over the oil barrel, and the diesel flowed along the ground into a shining river. Hawk's tinnitus suddenly intensified, as if countless bees were flapping their wings in his ear canal. This was the price of his golden finger, and it would occur every time he was highly nervous. He saw Frank rushing out of the maintenance workshop with a lit torch in his hand. The flames from the diesel instantly blocked the security guard's retreat, but Carl's gun was still there, and the bullet grazed Irene's hair and nailed into the wall, and the splashed wood chips fell on her upturned face. Like a desperate snow, lean against the wall, Hawk pushed Irene into the corner and stood in front of her. The cold air from the cold storage rushed in from behind, mixed with the sound of footsteps getting closer and closer. He felt his pocket and found the glass shards from the empty wine bottle. The smell of turpentine suddenly became very strong, so strong that it seemed to drown them in the darkness. Carl's shadow appeared at the edge of the fire, and the red dot of the muzzle was slowly climbing up to Hawk's heart. The iron roof of the repair shop glowed red in the firelight, and the burnt smell of diesel mixed with the pungent smell of turpentine made Irene's eyes sore. The red dot of Carl's gun muzzle shook on Hawk's chest, and suddenly stopped below his collarbone. That was to the left of the heart, deadly enough. Wait a moment. The clear female voice pierced through the smoke. Irene turned her head following the sound and saw Annie Green in a beige suit, running from the end of the corridor, her high heels making a creaking sound as she stepped on the broken glass. This secretary, who usually holds documents to her chest and even places her coffee cup at a right angle, now has her hair loose and her pearl necklace crooked at her collarbone, as if she was really frightened by something urgent. Carl lowered his gun slightly. "What the hell are you doing here?" Anne's fingertips were trembling, but she held the phone in front of Carl's eyes. An urgent notice just sent by the headquarters. Her Adam's apple moved as she swallowed. It said that the black account files must be sent to the Vancouver branch within half an hour, and Director Chen is personally watching. Carl squinted at the screen. Irene noticed that Anne's other hand was secretly grasping the hem of her suit, her knuckles turning white. This was the action she had seen at the protest rally last week. The indigenous women who were threatened by the mining companies always secretly pinched the corners of their clothes to cheer themselves up during negotiations. Nonsense. Carl sneered and raised the barrel of his gun again. "I've been working here for 8 years. When has the headquarters ever asked for documents in the middle of the night? Didn't you say last month that Director Chen had a new assistant?" Annie's voice suddenly became tearful. "That girl called me yesterday and asked me for the shipping route list. She said the director wanted to check the cross-border records for the past 3 years. She suddenly pulled off the pearl necklace around her neck. The metal buckle flashed in the firelight. "Look, I didn't even take off my personal belongings. I just ran here from the finance department." Hawk's tinnitus suddenly exploded, as if a steel needle was stirring in his ear canal. He stared at Anne's trembling wrist. He had seen that string of pearls at the front desk last week. Anne always said it was a relic of her grandmother, and she even had to wear gloves to wipe the dust. At this moment, the buckle was loose, and the 2 pearls rolled to the ground, floating in the diesel fuel in a turbid white color. Carl's eyebrows moved. In the distance, the sirens of a fire truck could be heard, probably because the fire alarm in the warehouse next door had been triggered. He licked his back teeth, and suddenly hit Hawk's shoulder with the butt of his rifle. "Okay, you 2 go with her to get the documents." He turned around and yelled at his men, "Leave 2 to follow and the rest go block the fire escape." As Irene was pushed forward, she caught a glimpse of Anne secretly winking at her with her left eye. That was the code word that Annie had slipped into her coffee when they met by chance in the tea room 3 days ago. The surveillance in the maintenance workshop will be cut off at 2 a.m. The secret room is hidden behind a ventilation duct in the archives on the 3rd floor. When Anne took out the key, Hawk noticed that there was rust on her fingertips, which must have been just pulled out of an old keyhole. As the door opened, a musty smell mixed with the smell of paper and ink gushed out. There were 3 green-painted filing cabinets against the wall. The top drawer was half open, revealing several stacks of documents tied with red ropes. This is the transportation log for the past 5 years. Anne pressed the emergency light on the wall. In the warm yellow light, her face finally relaxed. The departure time of each refrigerated truck, the cargo list, the border inspection record. She pulled out the top stack and turned to the middle page. Look here. The batch marked fresh actually weighed 3 tons more than declared. 3 tons of ice. Just enough to freeze 13 bodies. Irene dug her nails into her palms. She recognized the familiar Weibull number. It was the same logistics company's template as the refrigerated truck they found in Arizona. And this. Anne opened the second drawer and took out a sealed bag with several tubes of dark brown liquid inside. I stole it when I cleaned Carl's office last week. He locked it in the safe. She lowered her voice. My friend in the lab said this is a frozen thawed blood sample. DNA testing requires... Bang! The sound of metal colliding came from the corridor. Anne's face turned pale instantly. Hawk had already touched the police badge on his waist. That was where he hid the glass shards. They found that the surveillance was modified. Anne grabbed the documents on the table and stuffed them into Irene's arms. Go through the ventilation duct. The exit is behind the garbage station in the west.
Miss Anne?
Carl's voice mixed with the sound of footsteps stopped outside the door. Hawk heard the soft click of the keyhole turning, and the snap of the security guard's gum. Anne suddenly grabbed the coffee cup on the table and smashed it against the window. Amid the sound of shattering glass, she shouted at the top of her voice, "Hurry up, the documents are to be stolen."
Shut up.
Carl's roar made the doorframe buzz. Hawk dragged Irene into the ventilation duct. The last thing he saw was Anne being pressed against a filing cabinet. Her pearl necklace was completely torn apart, with the beads rolling everywhere, flashing a cold white light under the emergency light. Just like the white cloth covering the face of a corpse in a morgue, the moldy dust in the pipes made it impossible to open my eyes. Irene huddled in a corner, holding the documents. She heard the sound of something heavy being dragged from below, and Carl's muffled threat. "Tell me, where is the key to the ventilation duct?" "I don't know." Annie's voice was tearful, but more stable than before. "I really don't know." Hawk's tinnitus started again, this time mixed with the sound of approaching footsteps. He felt the gap in the pipe, and looked down through the rusty hole. The emergency exit indicator light at the end of the corridor was dazzling red. 6 security guards were carrying a ladder upwards. Carl stood at the front holding the key. The metal pendant on the key ring was shining. It was the same silver ornament as Anne's pearl clasp. There was a sudden muffled sound from the ventilation duct. Irene looked up and saw that the iron sheet above her head had a dent caused by something. Hawk pulled her into his arms. The smell of turpentine seeped out of his coat, mixed with the smell of ink on the documents, forming a vague mist between the two of them. "They're coming up," Irene whispered. Hawk felt out the glass shards and his fingertips were scratched and bleeding. There was a sound of sirens in the distance, much closer than before, but closer was the creaking sound of the iron sheet being pried open above his head, and Carl's heavy breathing, just like the dying breathing he heard in the desert last week when he was holding his colleague who had been shot. "Hold on to the papers," he whispered, pressing the shards of glass into Erin's hand. "If I—" "Shut up," Erin interrupted. "You promised to help me find my sister." The moment the iron sheet was lifted, strong light poured into the pipe. Hawk squinted and saw Carl's face appear above him. The gun in his hand pointed at them. But before that he heard a clearer sound. Annie's scream, mixed with the sound of some liquid splashing. and a sudden explosion like the crackling of fireworks. "Run!" This shout was sharper than before, carrying a kind of desperate ruthlessness. Hawk dragged Irene deeper into the pipe. Behind him, he heard the security guards cursing, and Carl's furious roar. "Tie that woman up and put her in the freezer." The document hurt in my arms. Irene touched the top copy. The edge of the paper still had Anne's body temperature. "The exit of the ventilation duct is just ahead." Through the rusty holes, you can see the barbed wire fence of the garbage station and the flashing police lights in the distance. But what was even clearer was the sound of footsteps approaching from behind, and the click of Carl cleaning his gun. The sound was so familiar, just like the sound of the Grim Reaper loading his gun that he heard in the border hut 8 years ago.
The iron sheet at the end of the pipe was suddenly knocked open.
The moonlight poured in, and Irene saw Hawk's face in the shadows with the scar at the end of his eye shining. The moment he pushed her out of the pipe, she heard the sound of metal colliding behind her, and Carl's heart-wrenching roar. "Don't let them run away with the documents." The stench of the garbage station was overwhelming. Irene staggered to her feet and turned back to pull Hawk, only to see several hands coming out of the pipe, grabbing his trouser legs. Hawk took out the last shard of glass and slashed the nearest wrist with his backhand. Blood splattered on the iron sheet like a blooming red rose. "Run toward the police lights," he yelled. "I'll cover you." Irene clutched the document and turned around, but she heard a sound around the corner that made her blood freeze even more. The sound of a key being inserted into the keyhole coming from the direction of the secret room. The voice was so soft, but it hit her heart like a hammer. She suddenly remembered the tiny camera that Annie had hidden in her pearl necklace, and the sticky note that Annie had put on the bottom of her coffee cup in the tea room 3 days ago. If they are discovered, they will first look for the evidence custodian. The sirens were close at hand, but before that, Irene heard clearer footsteps. It was Carl's leather shoes, stepping on the pearls on the ground, walking towards the secret room step by step. When the moonlight was torn into pieces by the clouds and leaked into the air vents of the secret room, cold sweat broke out on the back of Irene's neck. The sound of Carl's leather shoes was rolling over the pearls scattered on the ground. That was Anne's broken necklace, which now became a landmark to track them. "Who has the file?" Hawk's voice was low. His knuckles pressed against the back of her waist. His police badge poked her palm. She had just torn it off his uniform and stuffed it into her briefcase. The coolness of the metal mixed with the smell of ink from the document pages was like a thorn piercing her nerves. Irene touched the brown paper bag in her arms, and the edge of the paper scratched her collarbone. The sticky note that Anne had put in the pantry 3 days ago was still in her pocket. The words wrinkled by sweat. "Evidence custodian." Maggie's sample box, now squeezed together with these logistics documents and gas receipts, became their death warrant. Carl brought 5 people. Anne's voice was trembling. She pressed against the door, digging her nails into the cracks in the wood. "I heard him say in the corridor just now, he wanted to kill them alive. Alive." Aaron's throat tightened. What they need is a witness who can speak, not a corpse. But more pressing was the sound of Carl's footsteps stopping outside the door. Click. The sound of the key entering the keyhole is clearer than my heartbeat. Irene's tinnitus suddenly attacked, and a sharp buzzing sound came flooding back to her. When she was 12 years old, she squatted in the barn of the reservation, listening to the metallic contraction sound of the truck engine outside, which overlapped with the hum of the air conditioner outdoor unit at this moment. Wait. The air conditioner outdoor unit. She looked up suddenly, her eyes sweeping over the rusty machine in the corner of the room. The metal shell glowed coldly in the moonlight, and the vibration of the compressor was mixed with a subtle contraction sound that was the unique frequency of the old copper pipe's expansion and contraction due to heat and cold. She had heard similar sounds in 20 types of refrigerated truck engines. "Hawk, take it apart." She grabbed his sleeve, tear open the casing and knock the heat sink off. "Are you crazy?" Hawk's scar jumped in the shadows. Making noise now would be like holding up a torch to tell them we are. They already know. Erin interrupted, pressing her knuckles against her temples to suppress the ringing in her ears. But the sound of metal colliding can confuse the sound of footsteps. Annie, does your phone have a recording function? Annie was stunned for 2 seconds, then pulled out a pink cell phone from under her skirt. Irene grabbed the phone and placed it against the air conditioner's outdoor unit, recording 3 seconds of the compressor's hum, then turned on the speaker. As the roar of the machine exploded in the room, she grabbed Hawk's tactical knife at his waist and pressed the tip of the knife against the rivets of the air conditioner casing. Listen, I need you to make a louder noise than this. Hawk suddenly laughed, with a desperate look in his eyes. He picked up the fire extinguisher from the corner and smashed it at the external unit. The sound of metal tearing mixed with white mist of refrigerant rose up. Anne coughed due to being choked, but she also picked up the pearls scattered on the ground and threw them hard against the window. Those round beads hit the glass, making dense crackling sounds, which sounded very much like the sound of footsteps when escaping. Carl's roar came from outside the door. Left. They ran to the left. Irene dragged Hawk towards the window. The lock of the old sliding window was rusted. The moment she pried off the lock tongue with a tactical knife, the moonlight illuminated the drainage pipe outside the window, an iron pipe with a diameter of 30 centimeters, crawling along the wall to the ground. The wall of the pipe was covered with moss, shining slippery in the night. Annie, go first. Hawk stuffed the file bag into Irene's arms. You follow. I'll cover you. Anne stepped out of the window with shaking legs, and just as her fingers were grabbing the pipe, they slipped and she gasped in shock. Irene gritted her teeth and followed. The rain seeped into her cuffs through the gaps in the pipes, making her shiver with cold. When her feet just stepped onto the second-floor platform, there was a crisp sound of shattering glass behind her. Carl's men broke open the door. Catch that woman. The documents are on her. Irene's heartbeat almost jumped out of her throat. She was moving down the pipe when suddenly her foot slipped and her knee hit the pipe wall hard. A piercing pain shot up from her ankle, and she realized that she had twisted her foot when she landed. Hawk grabbed her by the back of her collar from above and carried her down like a kitten until their shadows hit the concrete floor of the parking lot. The lights of the police car flashed outside the fence, and Jack's voice came through the loudspeaker. Border Patrol, put down your weapons. But the situation in the parking lot made Irene's blood run cold. 3 black SUVs blocked the exit, and 6 people in security uniforms were coming out from behind the cars, with rubber sticks in their hands shining coldly in the moonlight. The leading man took off his hat, revealing Carl's sinister face. His right hand was in his trouser pocket, the outline of a gun clearly visible. Officer Reyes. Carl's voice sounded like sandpaper scraping against iron. How far do you think you can get with a lame woman and a fugitive secretary? Hawk protected Irene behind him, and quietly reached for his waist with his right hand. His gun should have been there, but just now in the pipe. In order to clear a way for her, he stuffed the gun to Jack. Now all he could rely on was the piece of glass in his pocket, and the documents in Irene's arms. The sirens outside the fence were getting closer, but suddenly all the headlights in the parking lot came on. Carl's men surrounded them in a fan shape, and the sound of rubber sticks hitting palms overlapped with the lingering tinnitus in Irene's ears. She looked at Hawk's tense back, and suddenly remembered what he said. In the desert, the most dangerous thing is never the sandstorm, but the quicksand under your feet when you think you can see the end. And at this moment they were standing in the middle of the quicksand. The treasure house is about to close, but the next puzzle is waiting. If it moves you, please gently like, subscribe, and pass on this piece. Sleep well, dear wanderer.